This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Welcome. You are about to embark on a unique learning adventure from the Great Courses. Our courses are crafted to be entertaining journeys, both comprehensive and fascinating. They're designed to expand horizons, deepen understanding, and foster epiphanies in a broad array of subjects and university-level disciplines. The lecturers are university professors and subject matter experts carefully selected by the Great Courses and its customers for their intellectual distinction and exceptional abilities to teach. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalogs or visit our website at thegreatcourses.com and imagine how much you can learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the company of some of the greatest minds in the world. These lectures are titled Shocking Psychological Studies and the Lessons They Teach. Your lecturer is Thad A. Polk. Dr. Polk is an Arthur F. Thurneau Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. He has been recognized with numerous awards, including being named one of the Princeton Review's Best 300 Professors in the United States. Lecture 1. Lessons from Tuskegee and Facebook.
Hello, and welcome to our course on shocking psychological studies. In this course, we're going to talk about some of the most controversial psychological studies in history and what they teach us, not only about psychology, but also about the right and wrong ways to conduct experiments involving human beings. And to motivate the topic, I'd like to start by describing a relatively recent psychological study that stirred up a fair bit of controversy. And then I'm going to ask you if you think it was ethical or not. I'd also like you to think about the reasons behind your opinion. The study I'm referring to is the so-called Facebook Emotional Contagion Experiment. Now, this study was conducted during a one-week period in January of 2012 by researchers at Facebook and Cornell University. The scientists were interested in examining whether positive and negative emotions are contagious, and specifically, whether Facebook users who see fewer emotionally positive posts in their news feed produce fewer positive posts themselves. To investigate this question, the researchers made changes to the news feeds of about 689,000 Facebook users. They randomly deleted 10 to 90% of posts that contained positive words from some users' news feeds. Other users had 10 to 90% of posts containing negative words deleted. And still others had the same proportion of random posts deleted to serve as a control. Then the scientists analyzed how deleting positive and negative posts affected the status updates of the users. They found that when positive posts were deleted, the percentage of positive words in people's status updates decreased by a very slight amount relative to the control participants, while the percentage of negative words increased slightly. Conversely, when negative posts were deleted, fewer negative words and more positive words appeared in people's updates. The scientists concluded that emotions expressed by Facebook friends can and do influence our own mood. In other words, emotions that are expressed on social media can be contagious. Now, this study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the most prominent scientific journals in the world. And it has had a major impact on the field, although it's not the impact that the authors had hoped for. Almost immediately, a number of people slammed the study as being unethical. Critical articles appeared in academic journals, as well as in popular outlets like Forbes, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and The New York Times. The study also triggered thousands of protest posts on social media. But why the outrage? Well, one of the main concerns was that the researchers tried to manipulate the mood of nearly 700,000 people. And for a third of those people, the goal was to make their mood worse rather than better. And as you might imagine, many people were concerned that the study could be causing emotional harm to hundreds of thousands of people. Worse yet, the people in the experiment weren't even aware that they were in an experiment. They were just browsing their Facebook site like they always do, checking their friends' posts and updating their own status. They never gave the scientists permission to analyze their status updates, much less to mess with their news feeds. Or did they? You see, before people can sign up for Facebook, they do have to agree to certain terms, including a data use policy. And the published paper actually mentioned this fact. Specifically, the authors said that the work, quote, was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, to which all users agree prior to creating an account on Facebook, constituting informed consent for this research, end quote. Furthermore, it turns out that Facebook manipulates news feeds all the time and analyzes the results for internal purposes. Given that Facebook can't feasibly include every post that friends make in a user's news feed, they use an algorithm to decide which posts to include and which posts to omit. And they regularly try different versions of that algorithm to improve it. So this study could therefore be seen as a standard algorithm test. The main difference is that this test was published in the scientific literature. Now, the scientists involved also pointed out that no posts were deleted. They just didn't show up on some loads of the news feed. But a post that was omitted for one load could show up in the very next load. And all posts were always visible on friends' timelines. Furthermore, the effect of the experimental manipulation was small, very small. In fact, out of every 1,000 words in the status updates in the week following the experiment, people in the experimental conditions produced about one fewer emotional word compared to the control subjects. One! The participants were almost certainly completely unaware of any effect on their mood. Finally, the scientists pointed out that the motivation for the study was altruistic. Many people are concerned that seeing lots of positive posts from friends might make people feel left out and unhappy. Well, the researchers wanted to find out if this concern was valid. But their results actually suggest the opposite. Seeing positive posts makes Facebook users more positive, not less. So, what do you think? Do you think the Facebook contagion study crossed an ethical line? And what about the scientists who conducted the study? Can you understand their motivation? Or do you think they were doing something wrong? Or maybe both? And perhaps most importantly, why do you think you feel the way you do? What are the criteria on which you're basing your opinions? More generally, what are the ethical considerations that psychologists need to abide by and keep in mind when they're conducting experiments on human beings? Those are the kinds of questions that we're going to address in this course. And we'll do it by discussing some of the most controversial and ethically questionable studies in the history of psychology. We'll talk about some very famous studies, like the Stanford Prison Experiment and Milgram's Obedience Study. We'll talk about controversial studies that were conducted on children and others that were conducted on soldiers. We'll also discuss some ethically doubtful studies of sexual behavior and gender identity. Now, many of these studies led to significant moral outrage, and some even led to changes in the policies and regulations governing research with human subjects. And as a result, none of them would be, or even could be, carried out today. And as we discuss each of these shocking studies, I want you to ask yourself, what is it about them that crossed a line? And what line was crossed? And perhaps most importantly, what policies and principles should be in place to make sure those lines aren't crossed in the future? Well, to get started, I want to discuss a little history. And I'd like to start with the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, you may be asking yourself, why in the world would we want to talk about a study on syphilis in a course about psychological studies? And the reason's pretty simple. The Tuskegee syphilis study has had a bigger impact on the regulations governing human research than any other study in history. And that includes psychological studies. It also illustrates some of the key principles that studies today must abide by. And that's because it violated pretty much all of them. So let's talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, as you may know, syphilis is a bacterial infection that usually spreads through sexual contact. Today, syphilis can be easily treated with penicillin. But before penicillin came along, the disease was much more common, and the recommended treatments included repeated doses of heavy metals like mercury and arsenic, which are toxic themselves. Some doctors even recommended intentionally exposing syphilis patients to malaria because the associated high fever could help in the treatment of the disease. Now, obviously, these treatments are not ideal, and there was very little data on how effective they were relative to no treatment, especially in patients who had had the disease for a long time. After all, syphilis can go dormant for decades before becoming active again. It's therefore natural to ask how much benefit there is in treating late-stage patients with something like mercury compared with not treating them at all. Are people who aren't treated more likely to die? Do they experience significantly more health problems later in life? And if so, what are those health problems? Those are the kinds of questions that the Tuskegee syphilis study wanted to answer. But how? Presumably, you need to follow syphilis patients who received treatment as well as patients who didn't receive treatment. Only then would you be able to compare the health outcomes in the two groups and figure out how effective the treatments really are. The problem was finding a lot of people with syphilis who have never been treated. But it turns out that surveys in the early 1900s discovered that there were a large number of African American men in rural areas in the South who had contracted syphilis but who were never treated for it. Most of these men were sharecroppers who farmed someone else's land in exchange for some of the crops. They were typically very poor, were not able to read, and had almost no access to quality medical care. And so, in 1932, the study set up shop in Macon County, Alabama, and tried to recruit as many of these poor black syphilis victims as possible in order to study the effects of the untreated disease. They took medical histories, they performed medical exams, they drew blood, and they conducted some diagnostic tests on over 1,700 people. They also wanted to perform spinal taps to check for evidence of infection in the brain and central nervous system. But spinal taps were painful, and they could also lead to severe headaches for days if they were done incorrectly. In order to encourage people to come in, the researchers sent out a letter portraying the spinal tap as a treatment rather than a test. Specifically, the letter said, quote, "You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it's finished, you'll be given a special treatment if it's believed that you are in condition to stand it." The letter concluded, "Remember, this is your last chance for special free treatment. Be sure to meet the nurse." The letter worked, and over 300 people came in for spinal taps. Now, by this point, the researchers had a lot of data from a large number of late-stage syphilis victims. They had medical exams, x-rays, blood work, and a large number of spinal taps. Most of the team assumed that data collection was done. How wrong they were. One of the researchers argued that they should really continue to study these untreated syphilis victims long term. These indigent sharecroppers were going to return to their lives, and almost none of them would get treated for their syphilis. So why not continue testing them over the next 5 to 10 years to see how the untreated disease developed? And if the participants would agree to an autopsy after their death, then the scientists would have much more direct evidence about the ways that untreated syphilis can damage the human body. The researchers therefore decided to continue the study. And to encourage people to participate, the scientists decided to offer what they called treatment, but which actually consisted of aspirin and tonics. Participants would also be given small amounts of oral mercury if they asked for it, but not at the recommended dosage. The study team also offered to cover $50 in burial costs for any participant that agreed to an autopsy after their death. Now, this was a significant incentive to the members of this very poor community, who often couldn't pay for a reasonable funeral. Ultimately, they managed to recruit about 400 people who had untreated syphilis for at least 5 years and who had not received significant treatment for it. They also recruited another roughly 200 people who tested negative for syphilis and 275 people who had been treated for syphilis during the early stages of the disease. And very quickly, they discovered that treatment made a significant difference, even the clearly inadequate treatment of the time period. For example, in 1936, they published a paper pointing out that the untreated group was 2 to 3 times more likely to have cardiovascular and neurological damage than the treated group. Now, remember, one of the main motivations for the study was to determine if people with syphilis were better off in the long term if they were treated with heavy metals like arsenic and mercury, or would it be better to leave them untreated? Well, now they had a very clear answer. Treatment definitely helps. Today, researchers in such a situation would be required to stop the study and inform the participants about what they had found. And ideally, they would also offer the treatment to everyone. But the Tuskegee study scientists apparently didn't consider informing the participants about their findings or trying to treat them. And they didn't have the money to provide treatment to everyone, even if they wanted to. What they did do was to continue the study. They continued to investigate how things progressed and to perform autopsies as participants died. Then, in the 1940s, penicillin became available, and scientists demonstrated that it was very effective in killing the spirochete bacteria that causes syphilis. In fact, penicillin is still the drug of choice in treating syphilis to this day. And by the end of the 1940s, penicillin was regularly being used to not just treat, but actually cure syphilis, at least when caught in the early stages. It was also often used in treating late-stage syphilis, although there was debate about whether it should be because the long-term effects of penicillin were not yet known. Now, today, researchers would be required to tell participants about a new treatment that is potentially more effective than what they're getting. And most researchers would offer the treatment for free if they had the resources to do so. But that's not what the Tuskegee study researchers did. From their point of view, if their no treatment group started receiving treatment, then that would make it impossible to draw conclusions about the effects of treatment. Essentially, they would lose their control group and wouldn't have anything to compare against. And so they didn't tell the study participants about the availability of penicillin. In fact, there's some evidence that they actively tried to prevent the study participants from getting treatment. For example, the entry of the United States into World War II meant that study participants might get drafted. And if they did, they would get medical exams and would likely receive treatment for syphilis. The researchers were concerned about this possibility, and so they contacted the head of the local draft board and they explained the importance of the study, saying that the study, quote, represents one of the last opportunities which the science of medicine will have to conduct a study of this kind, end quote. Almost none of the study participants ended up being drafted, and the study continued. In fact, it continued for decades. And despite the very large number of people directly involved in the study over such a long period of time, none of them raised concerns about whether it was ethical or not. Or at least none of them did so publicly. Likewise, despite decades of publications and public presentations about the study and its results, very few scientists or members of the public questioned the study's ethics or the ethics of the researchers involved. Very few, but not none. The person who is most responsible for exposing the ethical problems with the Tuskegee syphilis study is probably Peter Buxton. Now, Buxton was a social worker and epidemiologist who was tracking down people in San Francisco with syphilis and gonorrhea. He was interviewing them to try to identify sexual partners and then encouraging all those affected to get treatment. And ironically enough, he worked for the same government organization that oversaw the Tuskegee syphilis study, namely the United States Public Health Service. Buxton overheard some colleagues talking about the syphilis study in 1965, and he was very concerned. Here he was, devoting himself to making sure victims of syphilis were getting treatment, while the organization he worked for was withholding treatment from victims of this very same disease. For years, he shared his concerns with friends and colleagues. He filed formal protests, and he even met with leaders in both the Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control. But nothing was done to stop the study. That all changed in 1972. Buxton was having dinner with friends, and as he did so often, he told them about the Tuskegee syphilis study. And one of his dinner mates that night was an AP reporter named Edith Lederer. She asked for documentation from Buxton and passed the information on to her editor, and then to a more experienced reporter named Jean Heller. Heller wrote it up, and on July 25th, 1972, her story went out on the AP wire. The heading was, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The reaction was fast and enormous. The 1950s and 60s had seen the rise of the civil rights movement, and the fact that the Tuskegee study targeted poor, underprivileged black men was consistent with other examples of institutional racism. There was a demonstration outside the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington the next day. Reporters tracked down some of the study participants and discovered that most of them didn't realize what the study was about. The men mentioned being told that they had what was referred to as bad blood, but many didn't know that meant they had syphilis. And virtually all of them thought that the aspirins and tonics that they'd been given were a treatment for their bad blood. An ad hoc advisory panel was convened to investigate the study, and after reading many of the documents and interviewing some of the people involved, they determined that the study had been ethically unjustified. They pointed out that the participants had not been adequately informed about the true nature of the study and had therefore not given truly informed consent. The panel also mentioned that the men should have been treated with penicillin after it became available. A class action lawsuit was filed in 1973 and was ultimately settled for $10 million. And as part of the settlement, the U.S. government agreed to provide lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all study participants who were still alive. The study also came before a congressional hearing organized by Senator Ted Kennedy. And afterwards, Senator Kennedy proposed a national commission for the protection of human subjects of biomedical and behavioral research. The commission had two major charges. First, it was asked to identify the basic ethical principles that should govern all research involving human subjects. And second, it was tasked with developing guidelines that all human research should follow in order to be consistent with the ethical principles. The commission worked on this task for a few years and ultimately drafted a report during a 4-day conference at the Belmont Conference Center in Elk Ridge, Maryland in 1976. The report is now known as the Belmont Report, and it radically changed the way research involving human subjects is regulated. The Belmont Report identified 3 key ethical principles that should be considered when conducting research with human subjects. It also proposed practical guidelines that researchers should follow based on those ethical principles. Most of the psychological studies that we'll discuss in this course were conducted before the Belmont Report was published. And as we'll see, they all violated the Belmont principles and guidelines in one way or another. In fact, you can make the case that the way these studies violated the Belmont principles is precisely what makes them shocking by today's ethical standards. So I'd like to spend the rest of this lecture discussing those Belmont principles and guidelines, and then we can use them as a tool to analyze the ethics of each of the psychological experiments that we're going to discuss. Okay, so what are the Belmont principles? The first is what is referred to as respect for persons. Basically, researchers who do experiments with human subjects should treat those subjects with respect. The Belmont Report identified 2 key ethical considerations related to respect for persons. First, human subjects should be treated as autonomous agents who have free will, and they should be given the opportunity to decide for themselves whether they want to participate in the research study. In general, potential research participants should therefore be told what the research is about, how it will be conducted, and what risks and benefits are associated with it. And then they should be able to decide whether they want to participate or not without any coercion. The second ethical consideration related to respect for persons is how to handle research involving people with diminished autonomy, like children or prisoners and those with mental disabilities. Such individuals should be provided with extra protections to ensure that they are not exploited or exposed to unnecessary risks. In keeping with the principle of respect for persons, the Belmont Report recommended requiring what they referred to as informed consent whenever human research is conducted. Basically, potential research participants should be given enough information about the study to make a well-informed decision. That information should be presented in a way that the participants can understand, and participants should be able to make their own decision about participation without any threat of harm or inappropriate reward. Now, I think you'll agree that the Tuskegee syphilis study violated the principle of respect for persons in a significant way. In particular, the study participants were not given complete information about the study's goals or their role in the study. For example, many of them didn't know that they had syphilis, and most thought they were receiving treatment for their so-called bad blood, when in fact, they weren't. And they were never given an opportunity to make an informed decision about whether they would like to participate in the study. You could also make a case that offering burial benefits in exchange for agreeing to an autopsy was coercive. Now, the second ethical principle identified in the Belmont Report is what's called beneficence. Now, whereas respect for persons emphasizes letting people make an informed decision, beneficence refers to looking out for the well-being of research participants. In particular, do no harm, just like in medicine. More generally, the beneficence principle incorporates the idea of maximizing benefits while minimizing risks. This idea applies not only to the research participants themselves, but also to society as a whole. For example, the goal of most psychological research studies is to answer a scientific question about human behavior. And although the answer to that question could benefit society in the future, participating in the study itself often doesn't provide any direct benefit to the subjects themselves. Such studies would still satisfy the principle of beneficence as long as the risks are minimal and the subjects freely consent to participate. In light of this ethical principle, the Belmont Report recommended that all potential research involving human subjects should carefully consider both the benefits of the research as well as the risks. Studies should only be carried out if the benefits outweigh the risks. Making this determination is not always black and white, but researchers are always required to spell out the benefits and risks, and ethics committees that approve the research are then tasked with determining whether the risks are warranted given the benefits. Researchers are also required to inform potential participants about the benefits and risks of a given study before asking for their informed consent. Now, it's pretty obvious that the Tuskegee study also fell short in terms of beneficence, at least for the participants themselves. They were intentionally denied potentially helpful treatment for a serious disease and were not explicitly informed that this was happening. You could argue that the study may have had some benefits to society by demonstrating that syphilis treatment was beneficial, but most people agree that those benefits were outweighed by the harm done to the participants. Finally, let's turn to the Belmont Report's third and final ethical principle: justice. Is the research study fair? That is, does it treat different people equally, both in terms of sharing in the benefits of the research and in bearing the risks? For example, if a study is investigating a drug that could potentially cure a deadly disease, then the researchers should not exclude victims of that disease from participating just because they're poor or because of their race. Conversely, if a research study carries some risks, then the study should still recruit participants from different races and socioeconomic backgrounds. The practical application of justice is that researchers must develop fair procedures for how they select people to participate in their studies. They must be sensitive to issues of gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, and culture, and do their best to ensure that they're not being unfair to some social groups relative to others. Well, once again, the Tuskegee study would have to earn a failing score in terms of justice. The study specifically targeted indigent black men to participate in a study with significant risks, despite the fact that syphilis can affect anyone. Furthermore, the knowledge gained from the study largely benefited people who were much better off financially and who had access to quality medical care. Okay, let's finish up. In this lecture, we introduced some of the ethical dilemmas that scientists face when conducting research with human subjects. And in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, we also saw some of the many ways that research can go wrong. But the mistakes that happened in Tuskegee are far from the only mistakes that researchers studying human beings have made. And in our next lecture, I want to talk about two of the most famous and widely cited studies in the history of psychology, namely the Milgram Obedience Study and the Stanford Prison Experiment. As we'll see, although these studies provided significant insights into human behavior and have been extremely influential to this day, they also violated some key ethical principles and therefore could no longer be conducted. See you then.
This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Lecture 2: Pushing Good People to Do Bad Things.
Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to talk about two of the most famous, but also infamous studies in the history of psychology: Milgram's Obedience Study and the Stanford Prison Experiment. As we'll see, both studies taught us some very important lessons about human nature, specifically about how authority and power can have a profound influence on our behavior, and not always for the good. These studies significantly changed our understanding of human behavior and inspired entire lines of research that continue to this day. But both studies also raised some ethical dilemmas that I'd like you to think about as we discuss them. In many psychology experiments, knowing the purpose of the study could change the participants' behavior. And so it's crucial not to tell them the true nature of the experiment beforehand. Suppose you want to study whether bystanders will help a stranger in need. Well, telling those bystanders that their behavior is being observed could obviously influence the behavior of interest. Now, in practice, this often means deceiving research participants in some way about the study's goal. Essentially, the psychologist has to lie to their participants, or else the experiment won't work. So is that ever ethically justified? And if so, when and how should it be done? I encourage you to keep those kinds of questions in mind as we discuss the Milgram obedience study. Another ethical dilemma to consider is that the scientists conducting a study might have a conflict of interest and might not always consider the best interests of the people they are studying. For example, if a study is producing interesting results, the scientists running it might want it to continue, even if the experience is unpleasant for the participants. And as we'll see, this was a major problem in the Stanford prison experiment. But let's begin by talking about Stanley Milgram's obedience study, which was conducted at Yale University in the early 1960s. Now, this was right around the time of the highly publicized trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of organizing the transportation of Jews to concentration camps in Eastern Europe during World War II. He therefore played a central role in the death of around 6 million people. His trial was the first ever to be televised, and it generated huge interest all over the world. Before Eichmann's trial, most people didn't fully recognize the magnitude of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. But the television coverage of Eichmann's trial brought home those atrocities to millions of people around the world. And learning about the scope of the Holocaust led to many questions, including, how could all the people involved in carrying out these acts of cruelty go along with it? After all, the Holocaust was a massive logistical undertaking that required thousands of people performing a huge variety of different jobs. Eichmann may have overseen this huge operation, but he obviously couldn't have done it alone. So, why did all the German soldiers, and even many civilians, cooperate in this incredibly evil undertaking? Why didn't they simply refuse to participate? The answer that most of these people gave afterwards was that they had no choice. They were simply following orders. But wouldn't normal people refuse to obey orders like that? Wouldn't their conscience prevent them from going along? That's the question that Stanley Milgram was interested in answering. Now, Milgram was Jewish himself, and he was deeply affected by what he learned about the Holocaust. In fact, he once wrote to a childhood friend, quote, "I should have been born into the German-speaking Jewish community of Prague in 1922 and died in a gas chamber some 20 years later," end quote. Milgram decided to design a scientific experiment to determine whether ordinary people really will follow orders, even when those orders involve harming someone else. Now, of course, most people wouldn't volunteer to participate in an experiment if they knew it involved hurting other people. So, Milgram came up with a cover story. He posted flyers asking for men between the age of 20 and 50 to participate in an experiment on learning and memory. And when volunteers arrived, they were paired up with another person and were told that the experiment was designed to test whether people learn better when they're punished for mistakes. One of them would be the learner and would try to learn a bunch of word pairs. The other person would be the teacher, who would test the learner's memory and would punish mistakes by administering an electric shock. But it turns out that only one of the two people was an actual participant. The other person was just pretending to be a participant and was actually a Confederate who was working with Milgram. This Confederate and the real experimental subject then drew a slip of paper out of a hat, supposedly to determine who was going to be the teacher and who was going to be the learner. They were then asked what their paper said. Both pieces of paper said teacher, but the Confederate claimed that his said learner. And in this way, the real experimental subjects were always assigned to be the teacher, and the Confederate was always the learner. Next, the teacher and the learner were both led into a room that contained a chair with straps that looked sort of like an electric chair. The fake learner was then strapped into this chair, and an electrode was attached to his skin, supposedly to shock him whenever he made a mistake. An electrode paste was also applied with the explanation that the paste would help avoid blisters and burns. Now, once strapped in, the Confederate asked about the safety of the procedure, and the experimenter told him that, quote, although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage, end quote. The real experimental subject was then led into an adjacent room where he was seated in front of a machine that he was told would generate the electric shocks to punish the learner for mistakes. This shock generator machine had 30 switches set in a horizontal line, and each switch was labeled with a voltage in 15-volt increments. The far left switch was labeled 15 volts, the next switch was labeled 30 volts, and so on, all the way up to 450 volts on the far right switch. Furthermore, each group of 4 switches had a verbal label on the machine. From left to right, the labels were slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and danger, severe shock. The 2 rightmost switches were simply labeled XXX. The instrument was constructed of high-quality components and was professionally engraved with the name of a manufacturer in an effort to convince participants that it was a genuine shock generator that would deliver real electric shocks. When one of these switches was depressed, a red light next to that switch turned on. Then the machine produced an electric buzzing sound. A blue light labeled voltage energizer flashed, and a voltage meter swung to the right. And all of this was fake. No shock was actually being delivered. The goal was just to convince the teacher that they were indeed administering painful shocks to the learner in the other room. And if all that wasn't enough, the teacher was also given a sample shock before the experiment began. Specifically, he was connected to the machine, and the 3rd switch from the left was depressed, corresponding to a 45-volt shock. And he really did receive a 45-volt shock, although it was generated by a 45-volt battery hidden inside the machine, rather than by the machine itself. Now, after all this setup, the experiment itself finally began. First, the teacher was instructed to read a list of word pairs, which the learner was supposed to try to remember. Then the teacher would read the first word from one of the pairs, and the learner was supposed to choose the word that was paired with that word. The learner was given 4 options and supposedly indicated their choice by pressing one of 4 buttons. If the learner answered correctly, then great, nothing happened and the next test word was presented. But if the learner answered incorrectly, then the teacher was instructed to punish him by administering a shock. Furthermore, the teacher was told to increase the strength of the shock with each subsequent mistake. The first mistake led to a mild 15-volt shock. The second mistake led to a 30-volt shock. And the third mistake led to a 45-volt shock. The shocks would continue to increase in intensity with each mistake until the teacher either could not be convinced to go on or until he administered the maximum shock of 450 volts 3 consecutive times. Of course, the Confederate in the other room wasn't really getting shocked. In fact, he wasn't really doing the learning task at all. He was simply giving a predetermined set of responses with about 3 mistakes for every 1 correct answer. So the teacher was being asked to give a lot of shocks, and as far as the teacher knew, those shocks were getting very, very strong. Worse yet, as the shocks increased in intensity, the Confederate in the other room would start to protest. For example, when the 300-volt shock was administered, the Confederate would pound on the wall, In some versions of the experiment, the Confederate would actually scream and demand that the experiment be stopped, even claiming that he was concerned about his heart. Typically, the protests would stop as the voltage level continued to increase, and the Confederate would go completely silent and stop responding to the task at all, suggesting that he was either unconscious or potentially even dead. But the teachers were instructed to treat no response as a mistake and to continue to administer shocks even when the learner in the other room became completely non-responsive. Now, as you might imagine, the men who were serving as teachers would often turn to the experimenter to express reservations about continuing to shock the learner under these kinds of conditions. But the experimenter would always ask the teacher to go on, using a sequence of prods. First, the experimenter would simply say, "Please continue," or "Please go on." If the teacher still protested, then the experimenter would say, "The experiment requires that you continue." And if that wasn't enough, then the experimenter would say, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." And finally, if none of these prods worked, then the experimenter would say, "You have no other choice. You must go on." The goal was to see whether ordinary people would continue to obey the experimenter, even when they personally believed that they were causing the learner very significant pain and perhaps even permanent damage. Would ordinary American men obey unethical orders, like Nazi soldiers did during World War II? Well, what do you think Milgram found? Do you think most people would refuse to continue administering shocks in a situation like this? Or do you think they would obey the orders of the experimenter, even when they could hear the screams of the learner in the room next door? Well, the results were sobering. Out of 40 men who participated in the experiment as teachers, 26 of them continued to obey the experimenter's instructions and never stopped administering the shocks. That's 65%. And subsequent experiments done with women or in other cultures or that were performed in slightly different ways have found the same thing. Nearly 2/3 of people will continue to obey orders from an authority figure, even when those orders are unethical and clearly violate their own conscience. The take-home message is simple, but it's profound. As Milgram put it, quote, "Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives, against hurting others. And with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work became patently clear, and they were asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." End quote. That's a very important lesson, and so I think you can see why the Milgram obedience study has become so influential in the field of psychology. But I suspect you also experienced some significant misgivings about the ethics of the study itself as you learned about it. And if so, you wouldn't be alone. In fact, the study generated significant controversy when it was first published, and may even have cost Milgram the opportunity to get tenure at Harvard. And keep in mind, this study was conducted a decade before the newspaper article exposing the Tuskegee syphilis study, and more than 15 years before the Belmont report was drafted. So what do you think? Do you think this study crossed an ethical line? And if so, what was the problem? Well, consider the Milgram study in light of the Belmont principles that we discussed in the last lecture, namely respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. What most people find objectionable about the Milgram study is that it did not demonstrate an appropriate respect for the experimental subjects who participated as teachers. In particular, those people were told that they were participating in an experiment about learning and memory, And they were totally unaware that they were going to be asked to cause significant pain to other people when they volunteered. And as a result, most of them experienced quite significant psychological trauma. Milgram himself reported that they were observed to sweat, tremble, stutter, bite their lips, groan, and dig their fingernails into their flesh. 3 of the participants were even described as experiencing full-blown, uncontrollable seizures. Now, that level of psychological trauma would never be allowed today. All legitimate psychological experiments must be reviewed by a so-called institutional review board that reviews the ethics of every study and explicitly considers whether it satisfies all of the Belmont principles. The Milgram obedience study clearly doesn't and would therefore not be able to be conducted today. Okay, now I'd like to turn to another extremely famous psychology experiment that also had a tremendous impact on the field, but that also would not pass muster by today's ethical standards, namely the Stanford Prison Experiment. This experiment was conducted by Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University in 1971. About 10 years after Milgram's obedience study. Ironically, Zimbardo and Milgram were actually high school classmates. Like Milgram, Zimbardo wanted to examine the causes of unethical behavior. But rather than studying the role of obedience to authority, Zimbardo wanted to examine the influence of the situation or environment, specifically the environment of a prison. Now, prisons are obviously notorious for unethical behavior, and not just by prisoners. Prison guards at numerous correctional facilities have been found to be cruel and inhumane. But why? Is it that the people themselves are evil or unethical? Or does the prison environment bring out unethical behavior in ordinary people? Those are the questions that Zimbardo wanted to investigate. He decided to create a simulated prison, but one in which both the prisoners and guards were regular, everyday college students. He therefore posted a newspaper ad seeking male college students for a scientific study of prison life. The ad mentioned that the study would last 1 to 2 weeks and that participants would be paid $15 per day, which would be nearly $100 per day in today's dollars. Over 70 people responded to the ad, and Zimbardo and his team then interviewed the potential participants and administered an extensive questionnaire about their physical and psychological health, their family background, their criminal background, and their attitudes and opinions. They selected 24 men whom they thought were the most mature, the most stable, and the least involved in antisocial behavior. Half these men were randomly assigned to serve as prisoners in the study, and the other half were assigned to serve as prison guards. Now, note that all of the participants were completely normal as far as the psychologists could tell, and none of them had any obvious tendencies toward unethical or antisocial behavior. They constructed a simulated prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford University, where the prisoners would live during the study. They built a few cells, each of which contained 3 cots, and the hallway outside the cells served as the prison yard. There was also a closet that was used to put prisoners in solitary confinement. Video cameras and microphones were installed to record the behavior of everyone involved. The simulated guards were given khaki uniforms, a billy club, and a whistle. They also wore mirror sunglasses so that the prisoners could not see their eyes. The guards were strictly instructed not to physically harm the prisoners in any way, but otherwise, they were invited to use their discretion to keep order in the prison. An undergraduate research assistant served as the prison warden, and Zimbardo himself was the prison superintendent. To increase the realism of the experience, Zimbardo asked the Palo Alto Police Department to actually arrest the men assigned to be prisoners. The police went to their homes, put them in handcuffs, drove them to the police station, and went through a standard booking procedure, including taking their fingerprints. The prisoners were then blindfolded and driven to the simulated prison. When they arrived at the prison, they were searched, stripped naked, and sprayed with a delousing spray. They were then issued a smock with a prison ID number printed on the front and back for them to wear. The simulated prisoners were also given rubber sandals and a nylon stocking, which they were ordered to put on their head in order to cover their hair. Finally, a chain was bolted around each prisoner's right ankle. The goal was to make the simulated prisoners feel anonymous and humiliated, like real prisoners undoubtedly often feel. They were also required to refer to each other by their prison ID number rather than by their name, and the guards referred to them in the same way. The guards performed prisoner counts that were modeled after similar counts in real prisons. During these counts, the prisoners would be lined up in the hallway and had to recite their prison ID numbers. These counts provided an opportunity for the guards to interact with the prisoners and assert their authority. They happened at all hours, even in the middle of the night when the prisoners were asleep. Now, during the first day of the study, not much happened. The prisoners didn't seem to take the study very seriously, and they even laughed at the guards' attempts to make it seem like a real prison. But that changed dramatically on the second day. The prisoners decided to stage a sort of rebellion. They took the nylon stockings off their heads, they ripped the numbers off their smocks, and they pushed their cots up against the cell doors to prevent the guards from getting in. They also began to curse at the guards and refused to follow their orders. The guards responded by spraying a fire extinguisher through the bars of the cells to get the prisoners away from the doors. Then they broke into the cells, removed the beds, took away the prisoners' smocks, and put the leaders of the rebellion in the solitary confinement closet. Next, they decided to employ psychological tactics in an effort to prevent similar revolts in the future. Specifically, they withdrew privileges from the prisoners most involved in the rebellion. Those prisoners were left in their cells without their beds or smocks. Conversely, the prisoners least involved were given back their smocks and beds and were allowed to brush their teeth and wash themselves. These good prisoners were also given food in the presence of the bad prisoners who were temporarily denied food. Well, after this rebellion, things got significantly worse. The guards became harsher and began to act in ways that many would view as cruel and unethical. For example, they would force the prisoners to urinate and defecate in a bucket in their cell, rather than taking them to the restroom. Sometimes they even refused to let the prisoners empty the buckets, and their cells naturally began to smell. They also withheld cigarettes from a prisoner who was a heavy smoker as another form of punishment. One of the guards adopted a kind of macho cowboy image and seemed to enjoy his power. He was particularly harsh in his treatment of the prisoners, and they began referring to him as John Wayne, the actor who starred as a tough cowboy in so many Wild West movies. Before the end of the second day, one of the prisoners suffered what seemed to be an emotional breakdown, cursing, crying uncontrollably, and exhibiting extreme rage. Ultimately, the researchers decided that they had to let him leave the experiment. But doing so led to some new complications. You see, the experimenters overheard some of the prisoners discussing a potential escape attempt. The rumor was that the prisoner who had left the experiment was going to come back with some of his friends and break the other prisoners out. Now, even though this was just a simulation as part of a scientific study, Dr. Zimbardo himself was now fully invested in his role as prison superintendent, and he and the guards were very concerned about the possibility of an escape attempt. They therefore dismantled the basement prison and moved all the prisoners up to the 5th floor for the night. But the escape attempt never materialized. The released prisoner didn't come back. And the guards were annoyed that all their work in dismantling the prison and moving all the prisoners was for nothing. And if anything, their treatment of the prisoners got even worse. The prisoner counts turned into multiple-hour ordeals. The prisoners were forced to do push-ups and jumping jacks. They even made the prisoners clean toilet bowls with their bare hands and simulate sodomy. Then another prisoner, whose number was 819, had an emotional breakdown. He said he needed to see a doctor and began to cry uncontrollably. And rather than feeling concern or compassion for this young man, one of the guards lined up the other prisoners and ordered them to repeatedly chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess." Finally, after only 6 days of what was originally planned as a 14-day experiment, the researchers decided to call it off. But it wasn't because they themselves realized how unethical the experiment had become. They were all fully engrossed in their roles as prison officials and had lost sight of the fact that these were all innocent college students who had volunteered to participate in a psychological study. Rather, it was a recent Stanford graduate named Christina Maslach who pointed out that the study had gotten completely out of hand. She came to the simulated prison to interview some of the participants and saw the prisoners being marched to the toilet with their legs chained and with bags over their heads. She was very upset and said to Dr. Zimbardo, "It's terrible what you're doing to these boys." Well, somehow her appeal opened his eyes to what was going on, and he stopped the study. And in an ironic twist of fate, he ended up marrying the whistleblower. So there you have it, the Stanford Prison Experiment, one of the most notorious studies in the history of psychology. I think we can all agree that the study had some very significant ethical problems. What do you think were the most significant? Now notice that unlike the Milgram obedience study, the participants in the prison experiment knew what they were volunteering for, at least initially. The prisoners knew that some of their civil liberties would be temporarily removed. Likewise, the guards understood their expected role in disciplining the simulated prisoners, and everyone agreed to play their part. So, what was the problem? Well, personally, I think there were two major ethical oversights with the Stanford Prison Experiment. First, the researchers continued the study even after it became clear that participants were suffering. Even if they hadn't anticipated all the problems that arose, once they saw prisoners going through significant emotional pain and the guards acting sadistically, they should have immediately called a stop to the study. Instead, they not only carefully observed all this disturbing behavior, they actively sought ways to keep the experiment going. And that's a clear violation of respect for persons. The other major oversight was Dr. Zimbardo's decision to get personally involved by serving as the prison superintendent. By his own admission, he started to think more and more like a real prison superintendent. He began to lose sight of the best interests of the students in the experiment, thereby violating the principle of beneficence. That's an important lesson for scientists to keep in mind. In fact, sometimes the interests of the experiment conflict with the interests of the experimental subjects. And in those kinds of cases, it's important to have a neutral third party whose only concern is the welfare of the human participants. Okay, let's wrap up. Today, we talked about two of the most infamous studies in the history of psychology. Both studies taught us some potentially important lessons about human behavior, and in particular, about the factors that can lead people to behave in ethically dubious ways. But ironically, the studies themselves were unethical and therefore shock our moral sensibilities. In our next lecture, I want to turn to some studies that are perhaps even more shocking, and that's because they involved children. Studies involving children can be some of the most interesting in all of psychology, but they also demand our most stringent ethical safeguards, precisely because children are so vulnerable. See you then.
This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Lecture 3. Experimenting on Vulnerable Children.
Welcome back to our course on shocking psychological studies. In this lecture, I want to talk about two notorious psychological studies that involve children. First, I'll discuss the infamous Neubauer twin study, and then I'll talk about a study of stuttering that has come to be known simply as the monster study. Let's begin with the story of Bobby Shafran, his mysterious doppelganger, and the Neubauer twin study. The year was 1980. Bobby Shafran had just driven to Sullivan County Community College in the Catskill Mountains of southeastern New York State. And despite the fact that this was his first day at school and he didn't know anyone, students at the school were slapping him on the back, welcoming him back to school, and calling him Eddie. It turns out that Bobby looked exactly like a former Sullivan County student named Eddie Gallant. And that's because they were actually identical twins who had been adopted by different families 19 years earlier. But neither of them knew they even had a biological sibling, much less a biological sibling who was an identical twin. The story of these identical twins who randomly discovered each other after being separated from infancy generated significant interest. And a newspaper article describing the incredible reunion ran in some of the local newspapers with a picture of the long-lost brothers. And that's when things really got crazy. You see, it turns out that Bobby and Eddie actually had another identical sibling named David Kellman, who had been adopted by yet another family. And David was also completely unaware of the existence of any biological siblings. And that all changed when he picked up a newspaper and saw a picture of two men who looked exactly like he did. A few phone calls later, and the triplets were reunited for the first time since they were babies. The boys became overnight celebrities, appearing on talk shows with Tom Brokaw and Phil Donahue, being featured in numerous magazine articles, and appearing as walk-ons in the movie Desperately Seeking Susan. They moved in together and opened their own restaurant, which they named Triplets Romanian Steakhouse. They were even the subject of an award-winning documentary called Three Identical Strangers that was released in 2018. And as incredible as it sounds, it turns out they were not alone. At least 5 other pairs of identical twins at the same adoption agency had also been split up and placed in separate families. And those families also weren't told that their new child had a twin. Nevertheless, all these children were carefully followed and were repeatedly visited by researchers who tested their cognitive skills and motor performance for years after their adoption. You see, all the children were actually part of a scientific study that was overseen by an eminent psychiatrist named Peter Neubauer. Now, figuring out exactly what happened is challenging, but here's the basic story. The adoptions of all the children were handled by Louise Wise Services, a very well-respected adoption agency for Jewish children and families in New York City that closed in 2004. The agency was advised by a prominent child psychiatrist named Viola Bernard, who recommended that twins being put up for adoption should be placed in different families. In a recently discovered memo, she explained that she thought, quote, early mothering would be less burdened and divided, and the child's developing individuality would be facilitated, end quote. Now, this belief was not based on solid scientific evidence, and in fact, most developmental psychologists today would argue that the benefits of keeping siblings together far outweigh any potential costs. Nevertheless, based on Dr. Bernard's recommendation, Louise Wise Services began splitting up siblings and placing them in different families in the 1950s. Furthermore, in keeping with the closed adoption policy of the time, adopting families were not told about the biological mother or about any biological siblings. Enter Dr. Peter Neubauer, a clinical professor of psychiatry at New York University, who was interested in the forces that shape a person's personality and mental health. Neubauer knew about the identical siblings who were being raised in different families, and he saw it as an extremely rare opportunity to study the effects of nature versus nurture on human development. The basic question is profound. What makes a person turn out the way they do? Why are some people friendly while others are antisocial? Why do some people love classical music while others prefer jazz? Why do some people develop chronic anxiety or depression while others don't? Are these kinds of individual differences in personal characteristics primarily because of the way people are raised? Or is the major factor genetics? Which is more important to a person's identity and personality, nature or nurture? Well, typically it's impossible to tease apart the effects of environment from the effects of genetics. After all, we all have different DNA and we all go through unique experiences, even if we're raised in the same household. And if both nature and nurture are varying, then there's no way to figure out which is playing the most significant role in shaping our personality and individual characteristics. The only way to distinguish the two influences is to find a group of people who vary on one of those factors, but don't vary on the other. That's exactly what identical siblings who are reared apart provide. They grow up in completely different family environments with different parents, siblings, and friends. And yet, their DNA is identical. So if they end up having very similar characteristics and personalities as adults, then it provides strong evidence that nature is playing a dominant role. Conversely, if they end up very different as adults, it suggests that nurture is more important. Neubauer therefore decided to follow at least 5 sets of separated identical twins, as well as the infamous triplets, as they grew up. He recruited some research assistants and instructed them to repeatedly visit the children in their homes and to administer a whole bunch of tests, all while filming the children and observing their behavior. These research assistants all knew that the children had identical siblings growing up in other households. In fact, the researchers typically tested both twins. They just did so on different days. However, they were under strict orders not to tell the families about the other siblings or about the true purpose of the study. Instead, the study was portrayed as an investigation of the development of adopted children. And the study continued under that pretense for decades until it was finally stopped in 1980. And even after it was stopped, the siblings still weren't informed that they had an identical sibling out in the world somewhere, nor were they told about the true nature of the study. Of course, some of them found out anyway. I already told you the story of how the triplets, Bobby, Eddie, and David, found each other. But they weren't alone. For example, another participant in the study, a woman named Elise Shine, decided to go looking for her biological parents when she was in her mid-30s. She was also completely unaware that she had a twin, but she discovered the truth when she contacted Louise Wise Services in 2002. She managed to track down her long-lost sister, and the twins ended up writing a book about their experience called Identical Strangers. In fact, the title of that book presumably inspired the title of the Three Identical Strangers documentary that was made about the triplets. Now, in most cases, people who had been in the study were thrilled to be reunited with the brother or sister they never knew they had. Many of them reported developing a very strong bond with their newfound twin almost immediately. They also often discovered that they had a remarkable amount in common, even though they had never met before. For example, one set of male twins who were reunited in their late 30s discovered that in many ways they had lived parallel lives. They both coached hockey and had children who played hockey and who wore the same jersey number. They both got married in the same year and married women who were runners and who were type A personalities. Perhaps most astonishing of all, they both carried their wallets in their front pockets. I actually made a short home video to try to illustrate the point. Take a look. These coincidences weren't limited to just one set of twins. All of them noted surprising parallels in their lives, despite the fact that they had never met. Some of them had named their children with the same names. These coincidences weren't limited to just one set of twins. All of them noted surprising parallels in their lives, despite the fact that they had never met. Some of them had named their children with the same names. Others smoked the same brand of cigarettes, drank the same kind of beer, or studied the same subject in school. These kind of similarities suggest that our DNA plays a more powerful role in shaping our personality and habits than most people realize, a conclusion that is consistent with numerous other twin studies, as well as many animal studies. And if these examples don't drive the point home, I'd like to point out that I'm not actually Professor Polk. I'm his twin brother, Tim. Did we get you? Well, hopefully this video makes clear just how similar identical twins can be, not only in their appearance, but also in how they talk, in their mannerisms, and in lots of other personal details. Okay, let's get back to the Neubauer twin study. Initially, most of the twins felt genuine excitement about finally connecting with a potential soulmate, and most of them were very eager to learn about each other's lives and to compare notes. But relatively soon, many of the study participants also began to feel bitter and violated. The more they connected with their newfound brother or sister, the more they realized what they had missed growing up. And most of them deeply regretted being separated as babies at the whim of an adoption agency. Furthermore, at least 2 of the families reported that their children exhibited signs of significant distress immediately after the adoption. And in hindsight, they wondered if this wasn't a severe form of separation anxiety. Some family members were convinced that being separated from their identical siblings at 6 months of age was very traumatic for the children and may have contributed to mental health problems that many of them experienced later in life. In fact, at least 3 of the children who were part of the study ended up committing suicide. And some of the families wonder if being separated from their siblings may have played a role. Now, many of the twins also resented being misled over an extended period of time. The researchers had repeatedly visited their homes when they were growing up, and the children and their families believed that the goal was to study the development of adopted children. But all the researchers knew that the children were actually participating in a twin study, whose goal was to investigate the role of nature versus nurture in human development. And the twins particularly resented never being told that they had an identical sibling. After all, the researchers interacted with each child and their twin many times over many years, and yet they never told the children that they had a sibling, much less that they had a twin. Many of the twins said they felt like they had been treated like lab rats, with very little concern for them as human beings. And to add insult to injury, the twins and triplets who were part of the study still don't know what the ultimate scientific conclusions were. You see, in 1990, Neubauer and the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services donated all the records from the study to Yale University. In fact, if you search the Yale library system and look for adoption study records of the Child Development Center, you'll find that Yale has 66 boxes of records stored in its archives. But you'll also find that those records are sealed until October 25th, 2065. That means that no one can access them without the Jewish Board's approval. And initially, that even included the children themselves. However, after receiving repeated requests from some of the children involved, and after the study received significant publicity from the 3 Identical Strangers movie in 2018, the Jewish board relented and agreed that children who were involved in the study should be able to have access to their own data. And as a result, the children now have access to redacted copies of their own records, although they still can't see all the other information about the study, including the final conclusions. The study's results were never thoroughly described in a formal scientific paper. And so, naturally, many of the family members feel like all they went through was for nothing. It didn't even help to advance science. And if you think about this study in light of the Belmont principles, you quickly realize that it could never be conducted today. In fact, you could make a case that it violated all three of the Belmont principles. It violated respect for persons because it failed to adequately inform families about what was actually going on. Instead, the researchers misled the children and their adoptive parents into thinking that the study was only about the development of adopted children. So, to the extent that the families gave consent, it certainly wasn't informed consent. Additionally, the Belmont principle of beneficence requires that the risks of a study are warranted in light of the benefits, which also seems questionable in this case. After all, what were the benefits if the results are under seal and not available to advance scientific knowledge? And even if the results were available, it's not clear what conclusions you could draw from such a small number of participants anyway. Finally, consider the Belmont principle of justice, which considers whether the research is fair. Does it treat different people equally, both in terms of sharing in the benefits of the research and in bearing the risks? Well, in this case, the risks were borne entirely by a particularly vulnerable population, namely adopted children and their families. So the study also comes up lacking when considered in light of the third and final Belmont principle. Despite all these concerns, it's worth keeping in mind the context in which the study was conducted. The twins were separated because Viola Bernard believed that if the children were adopted in isolation, then they would have their parents' undivided attention, which would help them to thrive. Now, current evidence suggests that this belief is wrong, but Bernard's belief was nevertheless sincere and well-intentioned. Also, although Dr. Neubauer never published a complete description of the study and its results, he did write a book arguing that genetics plays a major role in who we turn out to be, entitled Nature's Thumbprint: The New Genetics of Personality. And that book makes frequent reference to the work done in the twin study in order to make the case. So the study did make a scientific contribution, although the contribution would undoubtedly be much more significant if the study and its findings had been thoroughly described and if the records had not been put under seal. Finally, it's worth remembering that all adoptions at the time were closed. That means the researchers were legally prohibited from telling the adopting families about the biological parents or about any biological siblings. The researchers were therefore complying with New York state law by withholding that information. And remember, the study started long before the Belmont Report and its ethical principles were formalized or put into practice. So in light of those considerations, I personally don't think Dr. Bernard and Dr. Neubauer were evil, nor do I think that their goal was to heartlessly exploit these vulnerable children for their own gain. But I'll let you draw your own conclusions. In any case, I think we can agree that the Neubauer twin study had serious ethical problems and would certainly not pass muster based on today's ethical standards. Okay, let's turn to another shocking psychological study involving children, a study on stuttering that was conducted in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student, Mary Tudor. Now, Wendell Johnson was one of the most influential speech pathologists in history. In particular, his work on stuttering has had a profound effect on the field. As one researcher put it, quote, "The body of data that resulted from Johnson's work on children who stutter and their parents is still the largest collection of scientific information on the subject of stuttering onset," end quote. His resume would be the envy of almost any academic. Dr. Johnson was the Lewis W. Hill Research Professor in the Department of Speech Pathology and Audiology at the University of Iowa. He was head of the Iowa program in speech pathology. He served as editor of the Journal of Speech and Hearing Disorders, a leading journal in the field. He also helped to found the American Speech Language Hearing Foundation and also served as its chairman. And if all that wasn't enough, he was also captain of his high school basketball and baseball teams. Now, Dr. Johnson died in 1965 at the age of 59, but his many contributions to speech pathology and to the University of Iowa are still remembered to this day. In fact, the building that currently houses the University of Iowa's speech pathology and audiology programs is named the Wendell Johnson Speech and Hearing Center in his honor. Dr. Johnson had an intense desire to understand stuttering and to help those who suffered from it. And that passion inspired much of his work. That passion was also very personal. You see, Dr. Johnson himself suffered from a very severe stutter as a child and young man. And that experience was undoubtedly one of the things that motivated him to achieve as much as he did. As Dr. Johnson himself put it, quote, "I became a speech pathologist because I needed one," end quote. Impressive stuff. And yet, outside of speech pathology circles, Dr. Johnson is probably best known for a highly criticized study that he conducted with his graduate student Mary Tudor for her master's thesis in 1939. The thesis was never published, and it sat collecting dust in the University of Iowa library for over 60 years. But in 2001, the University of Iowa publicly apologized for that obscure thesis project. 2 years later, some of the people who had been participants in the study sued the state of Iowa for damages resulting from the study. And in 2007, they were awarded around $1 million as compensation. The popular press now typically refers to it simply as the monster study, because some of the children involved were treated in such a monstrous way. Now, to understand the study, we first need to understand more about Dr. Johnson's personal history. He started stuttering when he was 5 or 6 years old, and he attributed his speech problems to the fact that one of his teachers told his parents that he was starting to stutter. He believed that others' concern about his speech made him self-conscious and led him to focus obsessively on how he spoke in an effort to avoid stuttering. And far from preventing him from stuttering, he thought that his obsessive self-consciousness about his speech is actually what made him stutter in the first place. As he put it, quote, "Stuttering often begins not in the child's mouth, but in the parent's ear," end quote. Most theories at the time assumed that stuttering was due to a biological abnormality that was primarily genetic. Johnson's radical idea was that the diagnosis of stuttering can actually cause the disorder. He referred to this as the diagnosogenic theory of stuttering. Diagnoso for diagnosis and genic meaning origin. And he was very eager to test his theory. And so in 1938, he recruited Mary Tudor, one of his graduate students, to carry out an experiment to do just that. Specifically, they wanted to see if telling non-stuttering children that they're starting to stutter would lead them to start stuttering. If so, it would validate his diagnosogenic theory and undermine biological explanations. Tudor studied a total of 22 orphans at the Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home in Davenport, Iowa. The children ranged in age from 5 to 16 years old, and none of them knew what the study was about. In fact, they probably didn't know they were in a study at all. They just thought that they were getting therapy to help them speak better. Now, 10 of the 22 kids were children whom the teachers at the orphanage identified as already being stutterers. And for these children, Johnson wanted to determine if giving them positive feedback about their speech might reduce their stuttering. 5 of these stutterers received positive feedback about their speech, while the other 5 didn't. Johnson and Tudor also recruited 12 other children who were not considered to be stutterers. Half of these children were also randomly assigned to a positive feedback group. The kids in this group received feedback like the following. Do you enjoy speaking? You speak very well. Your speech is of very good quality. Speak whenever you have an opportunity. You have the earmarks of a fine speaker. Well, so far so good. But the other non-stutterers were assigned to a negative feedback group, and that's where the most significant ethical concerns arise. Specifically, these 6 children, all of whom were judged to speak normally, were given negative feedback about their speech in order to determine if it would lead to problems with speech fluency. Mary Tudor worked with each of these children every few weeks for about 45 minutes at a time. She told them things like the following. The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. The type of interruptions which you have are very undesirable. These interruptions indicate stuttering. You have many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. In fact, you are beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Well, as you might imagine, this kind of negative feedback made the children very self-conscious about their speech, and most of them became reluctant to talk. About one of the children in this group, Mary Tudor wrote, "It was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before. She spoke slowly and very distinctly, saying one word at a time. I asked her why she didn't want to talk. She didn't answer. Then I asked her if she was afraid of something. She nodded her head. What are you afraid of? After some time, she said, afraid I might stutter." Another child in the negative feedback group was described as follows. Practically refuses to talk. I don't know and miss blank, only words spoken in first 3 or 4 minutes of questions. When given book, held book over face and close to mouth. When book was taken away, she held hand over face. Another child in this group began refusing to recite in class. Another became withdrawn and ended up running away from the orphanage a couple of years later, although it's hard to know if that was related to the study or not. Decades later, when she was reached by telephone, she said, I could never tell my husband about it. It just ruined my life. Ironically enough, although the kids in this group became very self-conscious and reluctant to speak, when they did speak, they didn't show much evidence of being more prone to stuttering. So the thesis definitely didn't provide much support for Johnson's diagnosogenic theory of stuttering. The ethical concerns with this study are pretty obvious. First and foremost, the risk of inducing psychological damage seems very real. And one of the primary goals of the study was to try to induce stuttering in children. The stuttering study therefore clearly violates the Belmont principle of beneficence, that is, minimizing risks while maximizing benefits. Respect for persons was also clearly violated. The children were not given appropriate respect as valuable human beings, and their extreme vulnerability was not given appropriate consideration. Not only were they children, they were orphans who didn't even have parents to watch out for them. Finally, the very high risks of the study were borne entirely by a particularly vulnerable population, namely orphaned children. And that's clearly unfair and is an obvious violation of the Belmont principle of justice. Okay, let's wrap up. Well, in today's lecture, we focused on Neubauer's twin study and the Johnson and Tudor stuttering experiment. And one of the things that makes these studies particularly shocking is that they involve children, some of the most vulnerable people in our population. Well, in our next lecture, I want to turn to studies that are particularly shocking because they were conducted by government employees and military personnel. These are people charged specifically with serving the general population, and yet, as we'll see, a number of experiments have been conducted that violated that trust in profound ways. See you next time.
This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Lecture 4. Testing psychochemical weapons.
Welcome back. I'd like to begin this lecture by telling you about three men who seemingly had little in common, but who were tied together by a shocking secret. Their names are James Stanley, Frank Olson, and Harold Blower. Let's start with James Stanley. Stanley was an eager and dedicated soldier who enlisted in the Army in the early 50s when he was only 15 years old by lying about his age. He served in Korea the next year and became a tank commander by the time he was 19. A few years later, he was a master sergeant in Fort Knox, Kentucky, when he saw an advertisement that said soldiers were needed for a study testing protective clothing and gas masks. Stanley signed up, and he was temporarily transferred to the Edgewood Arsenal facility near the northernmost section of the Chesapeake Bay, about 40 minutes northeast of Baltimore by car. After arriving at Edgewood, Stanley's life began to unravel. He became violent for reasons he didn't understand. He assaulted two guards and broke through a locked door. He began having hallucinations, which continued after he left Edgewood and returned to Fort Knox. At one point, he even attacked his wife and children, although he didn't remember doing so. He ended up getting divorced, but still didn't understand why his behavior and personality had changed. Next, consider Frank Olson. Olson was a government employee who fell to his death from the 13th floor of the Hotel Statler, across the street from Penn Station in New York City, in November of 1953. He was staying in the room with a fellow employee when it happened. His boss went to Olson's home in Frederick, Maryland, to break the news to his wife and three young children. He told them that Olson had been in an accident and had either fallen or jumped to his death. Well, naturally, Olson's family wanted to find out what had actually happened. How could a perfectly normal adult accidentally fall out of a hotel room window? Could it have been a suicide? If so, why did he do it? There were no warning signs, and by all accounts, he was happily married and successful. Finally, let me tell you about Harold Blower. Blower was a tennis pro who gave lessons at the Hudson River Club in Manhattan. He was married with two daughters, but in 1952, his marriage fell apart, and he fell into a depression. He decided to check himself into Bellevue Hospital, and he was subsequently transferred to the New York State Psychiatric Institute, where he began therapy. Blower remained in the Psychiatric Institute for about a month before tragedy struck. On January 8, 1953, he fell into a deep coma and died. His ex-wife was told that he had suffered an atypical reaction to a drug. Now, what wasn't revealed, and what wouldn't be revealed for decades, was that James Stanley, Frank Olson, and Harold Blower had all been intentionally exposed to powerful psychoactive drugs as part of secret experiments that were investigating the potential use of these drugs as mind control weapons. Yep, you heard me right, mind control experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, the US military and the CIA were both deeply involved in testing the effects of a variety of different psychoactive chemicals, including LSD, mescaline, psychedelic mushrooms, PCP, ecstasy, marijuana, and others. And they were conducting these tests on human beings, most of whom had no idea what drugs they were being exposed to. In fact, many of the human subjects weren't even aware that they were being administered a drug at all. Now, some of these tests took place at the Edgewood Arsenal, where soldier James Stanley's life began to unravel. To understand what happened, we need to go back to 1949, when a man named L. Wilson Green was the scientific director at Edgewood. Green envisioned a new type of war that did not involve killing or destroying property. As he put it, quote, "Throughout recorded history, wars have been characterized by death, human misery, and the destruction of property, each major conflict being more catastrophic than the one preceding it. I'm convinced that it is possible, by means of the techniques of psychochemical warfare, to conquer an enemy without the wholesale killing of his people or the mass destruction of his property." End quote. Essentially, Green thought it might be possible to win battles by drugging the enemy using chemical gases. But rather than using deadly chemicals, he wanted to use drugs that temporarily disrupted the enemy's ability to think and act rationally. And so Edgewood started a research program to investigate whether psychoactive drugs were suitable to use as weapons in psychochemical warfare. And that meant Edgewood scientists needed to understand how human beings reacted to these drugs so that they could determine whether the drugs would be effective on a battlefield. They therefore began to recruit soldiers through something called the Medical Research Volunteer Program. They offered soldiers the opportunity to be transferred to Edgewood Arsenal temporarily and to participate in their research. Advertisements went up around the country promoting the program, and thousands of soldiers volunteered. In addition to helping out their country, being transferred to Edgewood meant they could get out of their normal duties. As one volunteer put it, quote, "They started asking about who would like to go to Maryland to test new gas masks, over-the-counter cough medicine stuff. And I was thinking about it, and I'd been doing a lot of guard duty, KP duty, that was really sickening. When they said 3-day pass every weekend, no guard duty, no KP, and all you had to do was this, I just snatched my hand in there and volunteered." End quote. But as this quote suggests, the volunteers didn't really understand what the experiments at Edgewood would involve. The scientists began testing the effects of a wide variety of chemicals. One of the first drugs they tried was PCP, also known as angel dust. Some soldiers were given PCP and asked to run an obstacle course. Others had the drug surreptitiously put into a drink to test the effects. But the researchers soon discovered that the effects of PCP could be more serious and long-lasting than they hoped. For example, one soldier had to be hospitalized for 6 weeks because he experienced a very severe paranoid reaction that lasted long after the drug was out of his system. The drug that showed perhaps the most promise as a psychochemical weapon was called BZ. Now, BZ disrupts the activity of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and it can produce a variety of psychological symptoms, including disorientation, agitation, tremor, and stupor, in extreme cases, even seizures and coma. The scientists at Edgewood conducted a major field test to determine whether clouds of BZ could be used effectively against soldiers who were more than a quarter mile away. This test was codenamed Project Dork, and they even produced a video of the event, which they titled Cloud of Confusion, which was still on YouTube when I wrote this lecture. Other soldiers were repeatedly exposed to LSD in order to examine its effects. And one of those soldiers was James Stanley, who arrived at Edgewood in 1958 expecting to test gas masks and protective clothing. Instead, once a week, he was given a glass of water to drink. And what he didn't know at the time was that the water was laced with LSD. And that's when he began to hallucinate and to develop violent reactions. And unfortunately, he continued to experience hallucinations, flashbacks, blackouts, and fits of rage even after he left Edgewood. And ultimately, those symptoms led to significant personal problems, including his divorce and his estrangement from his family. And one of the worst parts of the story is that Stanley was never told that he had been given LSD. In fact, it wasn't until 17 years later that he found out. And ironically enough, he learned the truth when he received a letter asking him to participate in another Army-sponsored research project. Specifically, the letter explained that the Army wanted to study the long-term effects of LSD on soldiers who had been exposed to it at Edgewood. Only then did Stanley realize what had really happened to him back in 1958. Well, that realization led him to file a lawsuit in 1978, alleging negligence in the administration and monitoring of the project. Stanley's case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But in 1987, the court ruled against him in a close 5-4 decision. The majority decision argued that soldiers can't sue the military for injuries that are suffered as part of their military service. But that wasn't the end of the story. After learning about the case, a Florida congressman named Harry Johnston sponsored a bill to compensate Stanley for his ordeal. And in 1996, nearly 40 years after the Edgewood study, the Palm Beach District Court ruled that the experiment had altered Stanley's personality and had led to the decline of his military career and his first marriage. They awarded him $400,577 in damages. Now, I think we can agree that the experiments at Edgewood Arsenal had some very serious ethical problems. But it turns out that there were other government-sponsored studies going on around the same time that were arguably even worse. And I'd like to turn to those now. Many of these experiments were conducted as part of a top-secret CIA project called MK Ultra. The project started in 1953 at the height of the Cold War, and it continued for roughly 20 years. The CIA was concerned that the Soviet Union and their allies were developing techniques to brainwash U.S. prisoners of war in Korea. Now, if you've seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate or read the novel by the same name, you'll know what I mean. It's the story of an American soldier named Raymond Shaw, who's captured during the Korean War and then brainwashed to be a sleeper agent for the communists. After returning to the United States, his handler, who happens to be his own mother, orders him to assassinate the presidential nominee so that her husband can take his place. Now, although that story may seem a bit unrealistic, in the early 50s, the CIA was legitimately concerned that the Soviets and their allies were making significant progress in developing mind control techniques. And they wanted to make sure that they didn't get left behind. And it was in that context that the director of the CIA at the time, a man named Allen Dulles, authorized the MK Ultra project. The goal was to develop ways to control human behavior. And psychedelic drugs like LSD seemed like one of the most promising approaches. The MK Ultra project sponsored over 150 experiments that were conducted all over North America. In one particularly egregious experiment, the CIA hired sex workers to lure clients into safe houses containing one-way mirrors, behind which CIA scientists could observe. The sex workers would then give the unsuspecting clients psychedelic drugs, like LSD, typically without their knowledge. And the scientists would observe the effect of the drug on their behavior. The victims were unlikely to report the incident to law enforcement or anyone else because they wouldn't want anyone to know that they had hired a sex worker. In another shocking study, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron applied horrific methods in an attempt to wash and repattern the brains of patients who came to him voluntarily for treatment for mental health problems. He administered large doses of LSD. He applied extremely intense electroconvulsive shock therapy. He gave patients the drug Thorazine to make them sleep for weeks on end. And in a technique called psychic driving, he made them listen to the same repeated recorded message for up to 16 hours at a time. Many of these patients never recovered from this so-called therapy. In the words of Velma Orlikow, one of Dr. Cameron's victims, quote, "I suffer from chronic depression, which sometimes becomes acute. I call those periods my black holes. I don't see anybody, and I won't leave the house. I can't read, and I used to love to read. I can't write a letter. I have unexplained fears. I wake up at night afraid, and I don't know why. I'm trying to limp through my life like someone who's been in a terrible accident that leaves them crippled, end quote. Can you guess who funded Dr. Cameron's research? The CIA and Project MKUltra. And remember Frank Olson, the man who fell to his death from his room on the 13th floor of the Hotel Statler in New York? He was actually working for the CIA on the MKUltra project at the time of his death. But he ended up becoming a victim of the project himself. On November 18, 1953, he and a group of fellow CIA employees drove from Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, to Deep Creek Lake on the far western edge of the state for a retreat. And at some point during the retreat, Olson drank from a bottle of Cointreau that had been spiked with LSD. Soon thereafter, Olson is said to have experienced extreme paranoia and to have suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. The CIA sent him to New York to be seen by Dr. Harold Abramson. Dr. Abramson wasn't actually a psychiatrist. He was an allergist and a pediatrician. But he had been working with the CIA on their drug research, and he was very interested in the use of LSD in the treatment of mental illness. In fact, he edited a book on the topic in 1967. It was while Olson was in New York that he fell to his death. Now, Olson's family had no idea that he had been exposed to LSD a few days before his death, and they probably would never have found out if it hadn't been for a journalist named Seymour Hersh. You see, in December of 1974, more than 20 years after Olson's death, Hersh wrote a lengthy article for the New York Times that described numerous CIA abuses, including attempts to assassinate foreign leaders and to obtain information about the political activities of American citizens. Well, less than 2 weeks later, President Ford established the President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, also known as the Rockefeller Commission, because it was led by then Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. The commission was charged with investigating activities of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. The U.S. Senate and House quickly followed suit by creating the Church Committee and the Pike Committee, both of which had similar mandates. Although the CIA destroyed many of the documents related to their more questionable projects, these investigations learned about the MKUltra project and the large number of CIA-sponsored experiments in which people had been exposed to psychedelic drugs without their consent. They also reported the fact that Frank Olson had been exposed to LSD without his knowledge before he died. And they suggested that his death had been a suicide due to an extreme reaction to the LSD. In response, the government gave Olson's family $750,000 as a settlement, and both President Ford and CIA Director William Colby issued them formal apologies. But the story did not end there. Olson's wife died in 1993, and the children decided to have their father's remains exhumed to be buried with his wife. And they also decided to have another independent autopsy conducted. And that's when some more startling information was revealed. You see, the new autopsy discovered a large hematoma on the left side of Olson's head that had not been reported in the original autopsy. Also, the original autopsy had reported cuts and abrasions on Olson's body, but the doctors who conducted the second autopsy saw no such injuries. The doctor who led the second autopsy said that the evidence was, quote, rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide, end quote. The family now firmly believes that the CIA had Olson murdered because they viewed him as a serious security risk who could expose what was actually happening with the MKUltra project. Finally, in 2012, nearly 60 years after Frank Olson's death, his sons Eric and Niels filed a lawsuit seeking compensatory damages and requesting access to CIA documents related to their father's death that they claimed were being withheld. The case was dismissed partly because the family had agreed to a settlement back in 1976. But in his decision, the judge wrote this, quote, While the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, the skeptical reader may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations, far-fetched as they may sound." End quote. If you're interested in learning more about the Olson case, Netflix actually produced an entire miniseries about it in 2017. It's called Wormwood. So, what about Harold Blower, the tennis pro who admitted himself to Bellevue Hospital to be treated for depression? He was transferred to the Psychiatric Institute and died a month later. Well, it turns out that the Psychiatric Institute had a secret agreement with the Army Chemical Corps to test mescaline-based hallucinogenic drugs on patients. The goal of the research was to, quote, provide a firmer basis for the utilization of psychochemical agents, both for offensive use as sabotage weapons and for protection against them, end quote. As part of this research, Blower received injections of different mescaline derivatives on 5 different days in December 1952 and January of 1953. Blower was very apprehensive about the injections, and once he even lied about having a cold in an effort to avoid getting the shot. But he was given the injection anyway. Afterwards, he explicitly told the doctors that he didn't want to get any more shots, but they threatened to send him to one of the less pleasant mental asylums if he withdrew. And so he continued. On January 8th, he got his 5th injection, and this time, he got a dose that was 16 times larger than the first injection. The last few entries in the study notes are chilling. Quote, 11:12, increasing restlessness, intermittently generalized rigidity. 11:17, no longer talking, lapsing into coma, still restless. 11:30, becoming cyanotic, respiration rapid and stertorous. 11:45, quiet, deep coma, end quote. 30 minutes later, Harold Blower was pronounced dead. The report to the medical examiner implied that the drug was given for therapeutic reasons and failed to mention the experiment or its purpose. The medical examiner was also asked to keep his report confidential. And so the family didn't find out what had really happened until the Rockefeller Commission, the Church Committee, and the Pike Committee raised public awareness about these kinds of unethical experiments in 1975. The Army finally admitted the truth about what had happened, and 13 years later, Blower's estate was awarded $702,000 in damages. The cases of James Stanley, Frank Olson, and Harold Blower obviously raise a host of ethical questions and concerns. First, they highlight the critical need to obtain fully informed consent from all research participants before they get involved in the research. This is a core component of exhibiting appropriate respect for persons, and it was quite obviously violated in all these cases. James Stanley and the thousands of other soldiers who were studied at Edgewood Arsenal were often never told what drugs they were being exposed to, nor were they told what kinds of symptoms to expect or the potential risks. Many of the soldiers who volunteered were under the impression that they were going to be testing out gas masks or clothing, not being exposed to psychoactive drugs. If they had truly known what they were getting into, you'd have to think that many of them would not have volunteered in the first place. Likewise, most of the people who were drugged as part of the CIA's MK-Ultra project never gave their consent. In fact, many of them were completely unaware that they were being drugged at all. Frank Olson certainly didn't expect to get a dose of LSD when he drank from that bottle of Cointreau at Deep Creek Lake. And although Harold Blower agreed to be treated for his depression, he never gave his consent to be given large doses of mescaline derivatives simply to observe the effects. In fact, he explicitly asked for the injections to stop, but was threatened in order to obtain his cooperation. Well, that's a pretty obvious example of coercion, which is completely antithetical to the principle of respect for persons. You could also make the case that it's almost impossible to be sure that soldiers, like James Stanley, are participating in a study of their own free will. After all, they're trained to obey authority without question or hesitation. All these cases also very clearly violate the Belmont principle of beneficence. Remember, according to modern-day standards, psychological studies should always strive to maximize benefits and minimize risks. And at the very least, they should do no harm. But all the studies we've talked about in this lecture clearly did significant harm to some of their participants. Soldiers at Edgewood experienced hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and fits of rage. And of course, both Frank Olson and Harold Blauer died as a result of the studies they were in. Furthermore, it's worth pointing out that none of these studies followed rigorous scientific methods. And that's presumably because they were overseen by military personnel or government officials, rather than by highly trained scientists. For example, a legitimate scientific study of the effects of a drug would typically be conducted as a double-blind, randomized control trial. What does that mean? Well, controlled means that everyone would be tested under the same highly controlled conditions. Randomized means that some people would be randomly assigned to the experimental condition, whereas other people would be randomly assigned to a control condition. For example, people in the experimental condition would get the drug, while people in the control condition would get a placebo. But everything else for the two groups would be the same. And finally, making the study double-blind means that neither the participants nor the people administering the drugs would know who was getting the drug and who was getting the placebo. Otherwise, the knowledge about who was in the experimental group and who was in the control group could conceivably influence the results. Of course, that kind of rigorous scientific design is not what was done in any of the studies we talked about in this lecture. Rather, a bunch of people were given different drugs and their behavior was observed. The studies were never blind, and people were not randomly assigned to an experimental group or a control group. In fact, there usually wasn't a control group at all. As a result, it's actually hard to draw strong scientific inferences from any of these studies. So, in addition to exposing participants to significant risks, the scientific benefits of the studies were also questionable. In short, these studies all missed the mark when considering the principle of beneficence. And of course, lower-ranking soldiers are a vulnerable population in the military who don't enjoy the privileges that higher-ranking officers do. The same concern applies to experiments on psychiatric patients like Harold Blauer, or the patients victimized by Dr. Ewan Cameron with the support of MK-Ultra. These patients were seeking help for their illness, and instead were subjected to untested and ultimately very harmful procedures. They obviously deserved far better. Okay, let's finish up. Well, in this lecture, we focused on shocking studies that were conducted by government organizations like the military and the CIA, organizations that are supposed to serve the public, not harm it. In our next lecture, I want to turn to studies that address some of the most private and sensitive aspects of being human, namely our sex lives. When studying sex and sexual behavior, scientists need to be extra careful to protect the rights of the participants and to behave as ethically as possible. Unfortunately, as we'll discover in our next lecture, not all scientists have done that. See you then.
This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violent sexual violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Lecture 5. Assigning Gender and Spying on Sex.
Hello again. Well, I don't think any course on shocking psychological studies would be complete if we didn't talk about a couple of notorious studies that investigated sexual behavior and gender identity. That's what I want to do in this lecture. Let's begin by discussing the Tea Room Trade Study, which was conducted by Loud Humphreys for his PhD dissertation at Washington University in St. Louis in the 1960s. This study generated substantial controversy after it was published. In fact, some faculty members in Humphrey's department actually petitioned the president of the university to rescind Humphrey's doctoral degree after the fact. The infighting among the faculty became so severe that many of them ended up moving to other schools. And as we'll see, the ethics of the study continue to be debated to this day. But many people also see Humphrey's research as groundbreaking and view Humphreys himself as a hero. For example, the book describing the study won a prestigious social science award based on outstanding research and a great, quote, mutual understanding of the individual and society, end quote. So, why was Humphrey's tea room trade study so controversial? Well, one reason was that it investigated a very sensitive subject, specifically the practice of men going to public restrooms to have sex with other men. Humphreys actually visited public restrooms, observed men engaging in sex, and wrote up his findings. And he conducted this study in the 1960s, when such behavior was not only highly stigmatized, but was actually illegal and could lead to arrest and even imprisonment. Humphreys wanted to understand who these men were who engaged in these activities and why they did so despite the substantial risks. He therefore spent a substantial amount of time in these tea rooms, as they were often called, and made careful observations about what went on. He also interviewed many of the men who participated and learned as much as he could about them, including about their careers and their personal lives outside the tea rooms. And what he found was startling. One surprising finding was the sheer volume of sex that took place in the most active of these restrooms. For example, on one particularly busy day, Humphreys observed 20 sex acts in a single hour. He also regularly saw men waiting in line to participate. He once asked one of the participants if it wasn't kind of crowded. "Hell yes," the man said. "It's getting so you have to take a number and wait in line in these places." A second surprising finding was that although the participants all obviously wanted sex, they did not want intimacy. In fact, they didn't want any social interaction at all. For example, Humphreys found that in most of these encounters, absolutely nothing was said. The single word thanks was occasionally spoken at the end of an encounter, but even that only happened in a minority of interactions. Humphreys inferred that the men who engage in this kind of activity want it to be fast, impersonal, and anonymous. But by far the most surprising finding from the study was about the type of men who frequented the tea rooms. They came from all walks of life and all social classes. They included businessmen, gas station attendants, physicians, salesmen, and even a priest. Only 14% of them were openly gay. Another 24% were homosexual, but in the closet. And fully 38% of these men who had sex with other men did not consider themselves homosexual or even bisexual. Instead, they identified as heterosexual, and they viewed the tea rooms simply as a quick and easy way to get sexual satisfaction. In fact, over half of the men that Humphreys observed performing sexual acts with other men were married to women. Their wives typically had no idea about this aspect of their husbands' lives, and the men tried their best to keep it that way. By all outward appearances, these men were entirely heterosexual, and yet they regularly visited public restrooms and had sex with other men. The tea room trade study therefore demonstrated a significant inconsistency between the public and private lives of most of these men. Many of them were actually quite conservative in public life, both politically and socially. Some were active members of churches and other religious organizations. Many publicly denounced homosexuality as sinful and were staunch opponents of gay rights. It would therefore be natural to view these men as hypocrites who failed to practice what they preached. But that's actually not the way Humphreys saw them. Based on his interactions with them, he believed that many of them were deeply ashamed of their behavior in the tea rooms and tried to make up for it by trying to appear extra righteous in their public life. He referred to this kind of pattern as putting on a public breastplate of righteousness. Humphreys described it this way, quote, "Motivated largely by his own awareness of the discreditable nature of his secret behavior, the covert deviant develops a presentation of self that is respectable to a fault. His whole lifestyle becomes an incarnation of what is proper and orthodox," end quote. Humphreys also concluded that the behavior he observed in these tea rooms did not pose any kind of threat to people in the local community. Men who entered these restrooms simply to use the facilities were never approached for sex or harassed in any way. And the men who did participate were often among the most law-abiding citizens in the entire community and public life. Based on Humphreys' findings, many police departments began to overlook what was happening in the tea rooms and to devote more of their resources to stopping crimes that they viewed as more dangerous. The tea room trade study also had a profound influence on the field of sociology. In particular, the recognition that public and private behavior can be radically different significantly influenced theories of human behavior in the field. The work also led sociologists to adopt methodologies that tried to capture private behavior while recognizing that it might be very different from public behavior. Humphreys' research also inspired a generation of sociologists to study sexual behavior using similar so-called ethnographic methods. As one of the other sociologists from the same period put it, quote, "Humphreys was enormously influential on graduate students and younger scholars in the field of deviance, ethnography, and what we called participant observation. He was a true pioneer and a hero to all of us in these fields," end quote. But as influential as Humphreys and his research have been, his methods have also come under significant criticism for several reasons. First, many of the men had no idea that their behavior was being observed as part of a scientific study, and so they obviously never gave their consent. And that seems like a clear violation of the Belmont respect for persons principle. Now, you might wonder why these men let Humphreys observe their behavior in the first place, especially given that many of them were very concerned about being exposed. They did so because Humphreys misled them about his true intent. Specifically, he pretended to be a voyeur who would serve as a lookout in exchange for the opportunity to observe the proceedings. He would watch the door and provide a warning signal if the police were in the vicinity or if someone was approaching the restroom. He found that this was standard practice in many tea rooms, and so by adopting this role, he could avoid suspicion. But Humphreys wanted to do more than just observe the behavior in the tea rooms. He wanted to learn more about the men who participated. And that led him to adopt a strategy that most people consider the most unethical aspect of the study. He wrote down the license plates of the cars that the tea room participants drove. And with the help of some friends in the police force, he figured out who the men were and where they lived. And believe it or not, he then went to their homes and interviewed them under the pretense of conducting survey research. He asked them about their family and about their career, among many other topics. And that's when he discovered that many of the men were married and strongly identified as heterosexual. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't Humphreys worried that the men he interviewed would recognize him? Indeed, he was. He therefore waited about a year before conducting the interviews. He also changed his appearance. And apparently, these efforts were successful, because none of the men reported recognizing him. Now, these tactics were roundly criticized. I already mentioned that some of the faculty members in Humphreys' department were so upset that they sought to have his doctoral degree rescinded. But the study also led to outrage in the popular press, including a scathing critique in the Washington Post that called out social scientists in general for, quote, peeping into what we thought were our most private and secret lives. But there they are, studying us, taking notes, getting to know us, as indifferent as everybody else to the feeling that to be a complete human being involves having an aspect of ourselves that's unknown." End quote. On the other hand, there are those who note the importance of the study and who defend its ethics. They point out that the tea rooms were public spaces, and that observing public behavior doesn't typically require getting a person's consent. And that's true to this day. Current regulations overseeing research on human beings don't require scientists to obtain consent from people whose behavior is being observed in a public space. That said, observing sexual behavior in a public restroom that's being monitored by a lookout seems pretty different from watching people in a mall or at a football game. Humphrey's defenders also point out that he tried very hard to respect the privacy of the men he studied. He scrupulously protected their identities, and by all accounts did his best to make sure that nothing he did would lead to them being harmed in any way. And as far as we know, none of the tea room participants did experience any negative effects as a result of the study. So what do you think? Do you think Humphreys crossed an ethical line in the tea room trade study? And if so, what aspect of the study do you find most objectionable? Or do you think Humphreys conducted the study in the only way possible, and that his efforts to protect his research subjects make the study ethically palatable? It's worth noting that Humphrey's writing suggests that he strongly identified with many of his research subjects and related well with them. In fact, Humphreys himself came out as a homosexual years after the study was conducted. Okay, now I'd like to turn to a different study that in many ways is even more shocking than the tea room trade study. It's a case study of a boy named Bruce Reamer, who was born male, but who was raised female at the suggestion of a psychologist. The story is better known in the popular press as the John Joan case. Bruce was born on August 22, 1965, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, along with his identical twin brother, Brian, and the boys were both perfectly healthy. But the following spring, their parents noticed that their foreskins were closing, and that this was causing problems with urination. This is actually a fairly common condition called phimosis, which usually resolves by age 3, even without treatment. But in 1966, circumcision was a common treatment for phimosis, and that's what the Reamers' doctor recommended. And so, on April 27, 1966, Bruce and Brian were scheduled for circumcisions. Bruce went first, and unfortunately, the procedure did not go as planned. The urologist used a technique called electrocauterization that seals blood vessels while incisions are made. But Bruce's penis was essentially burned off during the procedure and could not be repaired. The doctors decided not to perform the procedure on his brother Brian, and his phimosis resolved on its own without treatment. Now, Bruce was seen by numerous specialists, but none offered much encouragement. As one of them put it, quote, "Insofar as the future outlook is concerned, restoration of the penis as a functional organ is out of the question," end quote. Bruce's parents had given up hope that their son would ever be able to have children or have a normal sex life. But about 8 months later, they saw an interview on the Canadian television network CBC that changed their lives and Bruce's future forever. The interview was with Dr. John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins who worked with people who had been born with ambiguous sexual organs. For example, girls who were born without a vaginal opening, or boys with a scrotum that was divided like labia and an extremely small penis. These intersex people were sometimes raised as girls despite having male DNA, and were sometimes raised as boys despite having female DNA. And in studying these cases, Money came to the conclusion that it didn't really matter which gender they were raised as. They seemed to do equally well, psychologically speaking, either way. And Money came to believe that people are born gender neutral and that they will naturally adopt whichever gender matches their physical attributes and their upbringing. He thought that if they have a penis and people treat them like a boy, then they will naturally identify as a boy. If they have a vagina and people treat them like a girl, then they will identify as a girl. And if they're intersex and have ambiguous sex organs, then they will identify with whichever gender other people attribute to them, although their ambiguous sex organs could potentially lead to psychological conflict. Now, based on this hypothesis, Dr. Money recommended that intersex babies receive sexual reassignment surgery at an early age, and that they be treated as the reassigned gender by everyone at all times. The goal was to remove any doubts or conflicts in the child's mind about their gender. Well, after seeing Dr. Money's interview on television, the Reamers decided to seek out his advice about Bruce's situation. They wrote to him and described what had happened to their son. He wrote back soon thereafter, and unlike all the other physicians that they had previously consulted, Dr. Money offered hope. He told them that he was optimistic that he and the doctors at Johns Hopkins would be able to help, and he encouraged them to come to Baltimore. Of course, that's just what the Reamers wanted to hear, and so they grabbed the twins, packed up a car, and drove to Johns Hopkins to meet with Dr. Money in person. He recommended that Bruce undergo surgery, and because a functional penis could not be constructed, Money suggested that Bruce's genitalia be made female and that he be raised as a girl rather than as a boy. According to Money's theory, the child was still gender neutral at this age and would readily accept his identity as a girl if his sex organs were female and if those around him treated him like a girl. Dr. Money undoubtedly believed that these steps were in the child's best interest. He was hoping that once Bruce received the surgery and was raised as a girl, he would become a she for all intents and purposes. And as a girl, she would not have to face the psychological trauma that might be associated with growing up as a boy without a penis. Money also hoped that after she reached adulthood, she would be able to enjoy a more typical sex life, even if she wouldn't be able to bear children. But it's also worth noting that the case provided an extremely rare and very exciting opportunity for Money to prove that his theories about gender identity were right. After all, if the child grew up embracing her female identity and behaving like other girls behaved, despite being born as a perfectly normal boy, it would provide the most convincing evidence to date in favor of Money's theory that gender identity derived more from experience than from DNA. Furthermore, as a scientific case study, the case had a beautiful built-in control condition, namely the twin brother Brian. Because he was an identical twin, Brian shared the same DNA as his more famous sibling. So if Brian adopted a male identity, while his sibling adopted a female identity, it would very strongly suggest that a person's gender was malleable and was determined by their upbringing rather than by their genes, just as Money's theory claimed. And the timing of the case couldn't have been better for Money. You see, when the Reamer twins first came to Johns Hopkins, his theory was beginning to be questioned in the scientific literature. In particular, only a year before Bruce Reamer's botched circumcision surgery, a young endocrinologist at the University of Kansas named Milton Diamond had published a scathing criticism of Money's theory of gender neutrality. The paper reviewed an enormous body of evidence from many different fields, suggesting that, contrary to Money's claims, boys are born with a very strong biological, genetic, and hormonal predisposition to be boys, and that girls are similarly born with a very strong predisposition to be girls. Now, although some intersex children might be able to adapt to being raised with either gender identity, Diamond's paper called into question whether that would be true for children who were not intersex. As Diamond put it, quote, "We've been presented with no instance of a normal individual appearing as an unequivocal male and being reared successfully as a female," end quote. Of course, the Reamer case offered the possibility of providing exactly that missing piece of evidence. When he was born, Bruce Reamer was unequivocally a normal male. So if he did undergo sexual reassignment, was raised as a female, and successfully adopted a female identity, it would powerfully validate Money's theories and vindicate Money himself. In short, the Reamer case had the potential to take Money's scientific career to another level. And it seems at least possible that these considerations could have clouded his judgment and biased the advice that he gave to the Reamers. At the very least, it seems fair to say that Money had a vested interest in seeing the Reamer child undergo sex reassignment and be raised as a girl. And that's what he strongly recommended. And after a few months of thinking it over, that's what the Reamers decided to do. So on July 3rd, 1967, when Bruce was 22 months old, the surgical team at Hopkins removed his testicles and did their best to construct female genitalia. His parents were told to raise him as a girl and not to tell him or anyone else about the surgery in an attempt to avoid psychological conflicts and emotional trauma. The Reamers began referring to their child as Brenda rather than Bruce. They also began using female pronouns like she and her, and in every other way they tried their best to raise Brenda as a girl, including dressing her in feminine clothes and giving her traditionally female toys to play with. Dr. Money also asked the Reamers to bring the twins back to Johns Hopkins once a year for counseling, which they dutifully did. These visits gave Money an opportunity to interview the children without their parents present, and to assess the extent to which Brenda identified as a girl. He also used these private sessions to try to reinforce her female identity. And some of the things that Money asked about and asked the children to do were ethically questionable, to say the least. For example, he asked both children very detailed questions about their sexual fantasies and whether they fantasized about having sex with men or women. He showed them pictures of naked children so they could see that boys have penises and girls have vaginas. He also showed them graphic, pornographic pictures of adults engaging in sex. And that wasn't the worst of it. Money actually forced the twins to undress and examine each other's genitals in front of him, sometimes with other observers in the room. He even asked them to simulate sex with each other, with Brian in the male role and Brenda in the female role. Now, Money's goal was to do everything he could to reinforce gender-specific ideas about sexual anatomy and sexual behavior. He wanted to be sure that Brenda thought of herself as a female in every way possible. And these sessions were his misguided attempt to make sure that she did. Money also used his observations from these sessions as evidence in scientific publications. For example, in 1972, he published a book called Man and Woman, Boy and Girl that included a description of the Reamer case. And according to the book, the case clearly supported Money's theories. Brenda was described as identifying as female, as having typical feminine interests, and as behaving like most other girls. 3 years later, when the twins were 9 years old, he published another report in which he claimed that Brenda was completely accepted as a girl by those around her, and that no one suspected that she had been born a boy. As Money put it, no one knows, nor would they ever conjecture. Her behavior is so normally that of an active little girl, and so clearly different by contrast from the boyish ways of her twin brother, that it offers nothing to stimulate one's conjectures. He also published a new book called Sexual Signatures that described the Reamer case as, quote, dramatic proof that the gender identity option is open at birth for normal infants, end quote. Well, these publications cemented Money's position as the world expert on gender identity. And the unqualified success of the Reamer case also had a major impact on medical practice. In particular, infant sex reassignment surgery, which had been rare and had been performed almost exclusively at Johns Hopkins, began to be practiced all over the world. Unfortunately, the truth about Brenda Reamer isn't nearly as rosy as money described in its papers and books. As her brother Brian put it, quote, "I recognize Brenda as my sister, but she never, ever acted the part." He added, "When I say there was nothing feminine about Brenda, I mean there was nothing feminine. She walked like a guy. She talked about guy things, didn't give a crap about cleaning house, getting married, wearing makeup. We both wanted to play with guys, build forts and have snowball fights and play army." End quote. At school, Brenda was the target of constant ridicule and derision by the other children because of her masculine mannerisms and behavior. Her teachers and other adults who worked with Brenda also noticed that she was different from the other girls. As one of them put it, quote, "Brenda's interests are strongly masculine. She has marvelous plans for building tree houses, go-karts with CB radios, model gas airplanes. She appears to be more competitive and aggressive than her brother and is much more untidy both at home and in school." End quote. And even though no one had ever told her that she had been born a boy, Brenda became increasingly uncomfortable with being treated as a girl. She became convinced that on the inside, she was really a boy, and she became more and more frustrated with having to comply with feminine social norms. By the time Brenda was 14, she simply refused to continue the act. She stopped wearing feminine clothing and let her personal hygiene go. Sometimes she would even urinate standing up. The situation came to a head when she went to see her endocrinologist and refused to submit to a breast exam. Seeing the obvious struggles that she was going through, the doctor came to the conclusion that Brenda should be told the truth. And soon thereafter, her father did just that. He explained everything that had happened. He told her that she had been born a boy, but that her penis had been damaged beyond repair. He explained the interactions with Dr. Money and the decision to alter her sex organs surgically and to raise her as a girl. Well, Brenda was obviously stunned and angry, but most of all, she was relieved. Now, finally, and for the first time, things made sense. She realized that feeling like a boy wasn't abnormal in any way, because in reality, she was a boy. Almost immediately, she decided to transition back to being male. She went back to being a he. He adopted the name David and underwent more sex reassignment surgeries, but this time to make him more male rather than more female. And David Reamer lived the rest of his life as a man. He even ended up getting married and becoming the father of children that his wife had from previous relationships. Unfortunately, this tragic story also has a tragic ending. In 2002, David's brother Brian died from an overdose of antidepressants. And 2 years later, David himself died by suicide, soon after his wife told him she wanted to separate. It's truly heartbreaking to contemplate all the terrible things that David Reamer went through. You have to wonder how different his life might have been if he had never met Dr. Money and hadn't been raised as a girl. I don't think calling this study shocking even begins to capture the magnitude of the injustice. Well, we're getting close to the end of our course, but we still have one more lecture to go. And I want to devote that lecture to more recent studies that were conducted after modern regulations were put into place. As we'll see, there are still plenty of ethical dilemmas that come up in psychological research today. Next time, we'll discuss some of those dilemmas and ask what more we can do to improve psychological research in the future. See you then.
This series of lectures contains graphic descriptions of violence, sexually explicit language, and offensive and dehumanizing language, which may be disturbing and may not be suitable for minors or other audiences. Lecture 6. Current and Future Ethical Challenges.
Well, we've reached the final lecture in our course on shocking psychological studies. We've learned about some truly appalling studies from the past and about regulations that have been put into place that would prevent such studies from being conducted today. So, Does that mean psychology no longer faces any ethical challenges? Yeah, about that. The challenges may be different, but they definitely aren't going away. Let's start by discussing how scientists could make use of the giant data sets that are now regularly collected in the digital world, while still respecting the privacy and confidentiality of individual people. Many companies now have access to a wide variety of behavioral data about hundreds of millions of human beings around the world. On the day I wrote this lecture, more than 320 million people were estimated to be active monthly Twitter users, posting thoughts and feelings about anything and everything for others to see. On that same day, 2.7 billion people were estimated to share many details about their lives and activities every month on Facebook, Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And 2.1 billion people were estimated to use one of those apps every day. Google processes something like 70,000 web search requests every second, providing insight into people's interests and thoughts. That corresponds to over 2.2 trillion searches every year. That's 2.2 trillion with a T. Then consider all the data collected by smartphone apps, by Fitbits, and other wearable technology. Information about GPS location, about physical activity, about diet. Well, about pretty much every aspect of human life is being captured every second of every day. And as you probably know, companies already use this kind of information extensively to market their products more effectively and in many other ways. If you've ever wondered how the ads you see on so many websites are selected and why they seem to be tailored specifically to your interests, now you know. But the availability of this kind of information also creates some exciting opportunities for psychological research. For one thing, these data sets provide an opportunity to observe human behavior in the wild. That is, you get to see how people behave when they don't think their behavior is being studied. Obviously, people aren't always honest on Facebook and Twitter, but these data sets also include lots of fairly objective data, like amount of physical activity and GPS locations. Another advantage is the enormous size and diversity of the sample. When you analyze data from millions upon millions of people from all over the world, the results you obtain are much more likely to be reliable and generalizable. Furthermore, this kind of research can be extremely cost-effective. After all, the data has already been collected. You therefore don't have to pay an army of research assistants to recruit participants and administer a bunch of surveys. On the other hand, this kind of research also poses new ethical challenges that the field is only beginning to grapple with. In particular, under what circumstances is it appropriate to analyze this kind of data? Now, one view is that as long as the data is not personally identifiable, then it's fair game. Current regulations don't actually consider the analysis of such secondary data sets to be human subject research if those data sets don't include personally identifiable information like names and social security numbers and birth dates. So, as long as that kind of information is stripped, then what's the harm? Each person would just be a single anonymous data point in a vast sea of millions of other data points, and no one could ever figure out who they are anyway. Or could they? That's the problem. When you have a data set that includes lots of different variables, it's definitely possible to figure out who individual people are. For example, if you regularly visit the websites for your local school district or city government, then I could probably figure out the general area where you live. Likewise, I could probably figure out your general age and your gender from the types of products that you buy. And with a few more variables, I could pretty quickly narrow down the possibilities. And obviously, if you throw GPS data into the mix, then the identification becomes almost trivially easy. Another viewpoint is that researchers should only be able to analyze data that is publicly available. For example, depending on a user's privacy settings, tweets and Facebook posts may be out there for the entire world to see. And many people would argue that such information is therefore also fair game for researchers to analyze. Fair enough. But one potential concern is that many users don't actually understand the privacy settings in Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. Some of those people might have actually preferred to make their account private if they had really understood the implications of being public and had known how to change the settings. But of course, there's no way to know who those people are. The strictest viewpoint would be to require that scientists obtain explicit, informed consent from every individual whose data they plan to include in their analyses. Now, that approach would obviously provide the greatest protection to the research participants, but it would also make it impossible to carry out many of the studies that researchers would like to conduct. So what do you think? There actually are no easy answers, and these issues will undoubtedly continue to be debated in the years to come. Another ethical dilemma in modern-day psychological research involves intentional research misconduct by unethical scientists. And the psychologist who is perhaps most notorious for such misconduct is a Dutch social psychologist by the name of Diederik Stapel. Stapel received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Amsterdam in 1997, and he rapidly rose through the academic ranks. He published a large number of papers that provided evidence for very interesting social effects. For example, one paper demonstrated that people have better table manners when there are wine glasses on the table. Another showed that when you think of yourself as an individual, other people's success is seen as a threat, and other people's failure reaffirms your own status. In contrast, when you think of yourself as a member of a group, then the success of other people in your group can be inspirational, and their failure can be depressing. In 2006, Stapel moved to Tilburg University in the southern part of the Netherlands, and he founded the Tilburg Institute for Behavioral Economics Research. In 2009, he received a Career Trajectory Award in recognition of his growing reputation. And in 2010, he was chosen to be Dean of the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the university. In 2011, he reached the pinnacle of his career when he published a highly publicized article in Science magazine. The article described an experiment providing evidence that people are more racist in messy environments than they are in clean environments. Based on their results, Stapel and his co-author argued that people use racist stereotyping as a kind of mental cleaning device when they're exposed to chaos in their environment. Now, Science magazine, the journal in which the paper was published, is arguably the single most prestigious scientific journal in the world. It only publishes a tiny fraction of all the papers that scientists send in for consideration. So the journal's reviewers have to be convinced that a paper makes a truly groundbreaking contribution for it to be published. And Stapel's paper passed that bar. But it turns out that the experiment he described in that paper had never been done at all. He simply made up some data that were consistent with his racism as mental cleaning hypothesis, and then wrote up the article based on the fabricated data. And unfortunately, it wasn't the first time Stapel had done that. In fact, when all was said and done, 58 of Stapel's articles had to be retracted from the scientific literature based on concerns over the validity of his data. 58. And keep in mind, virtually all of these papers were written with other scientists, including Stapel's own graduate students. And you might wonder how that could possibly happen. Wouldn't his co-authors see what was going on? Well, in the case of his students, he would work closely with them to design the study and even create the materials to be used. But then, Stapel himself would insist on having complete control over data collection. He claimed that he had connections at secondary schools in surrounding regions where the data collection would take place. But he never actually went to these secondary schools. Instead, he just made up the data himself on his computer. A few weeks later, he would present his students with a complete data set and invite them to analyze it and write it up for publication. Many of his students thought he was doing them a favor and saving them a lot of work. He adopted a similar strategy with other social psychologists in the field with whom he wanted to work. He would design a fictional experiment and then fabricate a data set with results that were consistent with a particular hypothesis. He then contacted social psychologists whose work was related to the fictional experiment and told them he had a data set that had not yet been analyzed. He asked if they'd be interested in collaborating to analyze the data and write it up for publication. And many of these scientists said yes. Well, this house of cards came tumbling down in 2011, soon after the paper in Science magazine was published. 3 of Staples' junior colleagues had become suspicious about many of his results. All of his experiments seemed to work, and the data were always extremely convincing. Well, that's just not how science works in practice. Lots of plausible, intriguing hypotheses turn out to be wrong. And experimental data is often messy and ambiguous. But it seemed like Staples' hypotheses were always confirmed, and that the data supporting them were always clean and easily interpretable. It just seemed too good to be true. And so these colleagues began covertly observing him. And that's when they discovered the truth. For example, after loading up his car with questionnaires that he said he was going to administer to students in a nearby town, they saw him drive off and dump the questionnaires into a trash bin. Nevertheless, a few weeks later, another beautiful data set showed up, confirming whatever hypothesis the questionnaires were designed to test. Well, once these colleagues were convinced, they reported him. And the rest, as they say, is history. Panels were convened to investigate the charges, and soon enough, the truth came out. His story made headlines, and the popular press in the Netherlands followed the case for months. Staple lost his job and any chance at continuing his research career. The official reports confirmed that his colleagues and students were completely unaware of the fraud, and they cleared them of any wrongdoing. Nevertheless, many of their papers had to be retracted, and so the ordeal significantly damaged their careers. His students were hit particularly hard. Imagine trying to get a job as a scientist when most of the experiments you worked on were never actually performed. Now, the case of Diederik Stapel is extreme, but he's not alone. In 2001, a social psychologist named Karen Ruggiero admitted to fabricating data in 5 of her published studies, and she resigned from her faculty job at the University of Texas at Austin. In 2011, the extremely prominent Harvard psychologist Mark Hauser resigned after an investigation found evidence that he had fabricated and falsified data in numerous studies investigating animal cognition. And most recently, Brian Wansink resigned from his faculty position at Cornell after an investigation concluded that he had committed scientific misconduct, including data falsification in numerous prominent publications involving people's eating behavior. Now, it's important to remember that these are unusual cases where a single individual acted unethically. And it's natural to assume that the vast majority of research findings in psychology are solid and can be trusted. Yeah, about that. I'd like to conclude the course by telling you about a few other recent shocking psychological studies. But what makes these studies shocking is not that they were unethical. No, they're shocking because they suggest that many of the published findings in the psychological literature are not as reliable as we thought. One of these studies was published by the Open Science Collaboration in August of 2015. Ironically enough, the study was published in Science magazine, the same journal where Diederik Stapel had published his fictional racism study. The Open Science Collaboration consisted of 270 scientists from all over the world who agreed to try to replicate studies that had been published in 3 very respected psychology journals in the year 2008. The teams managed to rerun 100 different psychological studies, and they did their best to run those studies in the same way they had originally been run, including using the original materials if they were available, and consulting with some of the original authors to make sure that their study was appropriately designed. Well, the results were shocking in a couple of ways. First, the size of the effects observed in the replication attempts were much smaller than the effects that had been reported in the original studies. In fact, on average, the effect sizes were only half as big as originally reported. Worse yet, only 36% of the replications produced statistically significant results, whereas 97% of the original studies had. In 2018, another study was published that made a similar attempt to replicate 21 social science studies that had been published in the 2 most prestigious general science journals, Nature and Science magazine. This study tested about 5 times as many participants as the original studies had in order to make sure that there was sufficient statistical power to observe effects, even if those effects were small. But despite these efforts, the scientists were unable to replicate the published findings from 8 of the 21 studies. And like the Open Science Collaboration Project, the size of the effects in the replication were on average about half as big as they had been in the original papers. The Many Labs project has also conducted similar replication studies, but rather than conducting a single replication of many studies, that project has attempted to conduct many replications of a few studies. There have actually been several Many Labs projects, all with this same goal. In Many Labs 1, which was published in 2014, 36 different research teams around the world reran the same 13 studies. They then combined results across all the research teams to produce extremely well-powered replication attempts with over 6,000 participants. 10 of the 13 studies replicated, but 3 did not. In 2018, Many Labs 2 used the same approach to try to replicate 28 other psychological findings. Only 54% of those findings were replicated. Likewise, Many Labs 3 tried to replicate 10 published findings, but only managed to replicate 3 of them. The take-home message is pretty clear. Psychology has a serious replication crisis. Many of the published findings that we assumed were well established actually aren't. The problem is particularly severe in social psychology, but it extends to other parts of the field. In fact, the problem extends to many other scientific fields, including biology, genetics, and medicine. But why? What is going on? Are there a whole bunch of Diederik Staples out there manipulating data or fabricating entire data sets? Probably not. But the replication crisis does suggest that there are some flaws in current scientific practice that need to be addressed. Let me try to give you a feel for some of the issues. First, the standard approach to determining whether an empirical result is statistically significant has some problems. Scientific experiments typically test whether changing one variable has a significant effect on an outcome variable. The variable that is changed is called the independent variable, and the outcome variable is called the dependent variable. In Diederik Staples' fictional study from Science magazine, the independent variable was the cleanliness of the environment, and the dependent variable was a measure of racist behavior, specifically how far away white participants sat from African Americans. He made up data suggesting that white participants sat significantly further away from African Americans when the surrounding environment was messy compared with when it was clean. In other words, changing the independent variable of messiness was claimed to have a significant effect on the dependent variable, which was how far away people sat from others. Now, all experiments test whether manipulating an independent variable has a significant effect on a dependent variable, whether it's a psychology experiment, a chemistry experiment, or a biology experiment. But the critical question is, what constitutes a significant effect? Now, the traditional approach is to try to assess the reliability of the effect. After all, no measurement is perfect. If a thermometer says that your body temperature is 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that it was actually 98.6 or 98.8. And the same thermometer could give a slightly different reading tomorrow due to other factors like the temperature of the air, or slight differences in the way you took your temperature, or even in the thermometer itself. That's called measurement error, and it's present in every single experiment, including every psychology experiment. But that raises a problem. Suppose you run an experiment and find that changing your independent variable leads to a change in your dependent variable. What caused the change? The hope is that it was your manipulation of the independent variable. For example, maybe changing from a clean to a messy environment really does make white people sit further away from African Americans. But another possibility is that the observed effect is just due to measurement error. So, how do you tell the difference? Well, most studies use an approach called null hypothesis significance testing. First, you look at how big of an effect manipulating the independent variable had on the dependent variable in your experiment. For example, how much further away did people sit when the environment was messy compared with when it was clean? If they sat a lot further away, then that would be a big effect size. But if they only sat a little bit further away, then that would be a small effect size. And obviously, big effect sizes are much more convincing. Next, you ask, what's the probability that I would get an effect of the size I observed, assuming that my independent variable isn't related to my dependent variable? If that probability is very low, like less than 5%, then you reject the so-called null hypothesis of no effect. And instead, you accept the alternative hypothesis that the independent variable did have an effect on the dependent variable. Sounds reasonable, right? Yeah, about that. Here's the issue. Scientists all over the world conduct lots and lots of experiments that get relegated to the file drawer and never get published. In fact, most studies probably never get published. Why? Because they didn't produce a large enough effect to reject the null hypothesis using that 5% criterion. And if you can't reject the null hypothesis of no effect, then it's hard to convince other scientists that your results provide convincing evidence for or against any scientific hypothesis. On the other hand, if you run an experiment and the probability of getting the observed effect is less than 5% under the null hypothesis, then you almost always publish it. In that case, you've passed the conventional bar that scientists have implicitly agreed on. And so it's natural to write it up and send it off to a scientific journal so that other scientists can read about it. But think about that for a minute. Using that 5% criterion means that up to 1 out of 20 studies will produce a significant effect even when the null hypothesis is true and nothing is going on. So if you tested the same hypothesis over and over again in multiple experiments, occasionally you might get results that allow you to reject the null hypothesis just because of measurement error, even if the null hypothesis is true. Now, that wouldn't be such a problem if each experiment was only done once. But keep in mind, there are scientists all over the world who are studying the same topics and who are trying to test very similar hypotheses. So similar experiments get done all the time. And if any of those experiments produce an effect that is large enough to reject the null hypothesis, then it's likely to be published. Dozens of other labs around the world may have previously run a very similar experiment and failed to find significant effects, but those experiments were likely never published. And so the scientific literature would only include the one study that actually did produce a significant effect. The result is a significant bias in the scientific literature, with a significant percentage of published results that aren't actually reliable. And of course, that's exactly what the projects that have attempted to replicate existing studies have found. So, null hypothesis significance testing, combined with the practice of rarely publishing null results, is probably one important factor contributing to the replication crisis. Another factor is the use of questionable research practices by some scientists. You may have heard the phrase publish or perish. It refers to the idea that if academics don't regularly publish books and papers, then they will inevitably perish professionally. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that idea, particularly for scientists at major research universities. Published papers are the coin of the realm, and published papers that get cited by lots of other scientists are the gold coins of the realm. The number of papers that you publish and the number of times those papers are cited play a major role in determining whether you'll be able to get a faculty job, whether you'll get a grant to support your research, and what kind of raise you'll get at the end of the year. There's therefore substantial pressure to publish scientific articles, particularly articles that make a splash. And when that pressure gets too severe, some scientists cut corners. We've already seen examples of scientists who flat out made up data, but there are much more subtle practices that can bias results and artificially increase the chances of rejecting that null hypothesis. For example, you could analyze your data in lots of different ways and choose the method that produces the largest effect size. You could reanalyze your data set after every participant you test and stop immediately if you happen to achieve statistical significance. You could also collect data on a whole bunch of different variables and then test if the relationship between any pair of variables passes the 5% threshold. And then you could just report that relationship as if it was your original hypothesis. Now, of course, if you perform enough tests, there's a good chance that one of them will pass the 5% threshold, even if the null hypothesis is actually true. In 2011, Joseph Simmons at the University of Pennsylvania published a paper with a couple of his colleagues in which they tested how these kinds of questionable research practices can affect scientific results. First, they had a computer generate random data in which they knew that the null hypothesis was true, so there definitely was no real effect. Nevertheless, when they adopted the questionable research practices just described, they were able to produce a result that passed that 5% threshold more than 60% of the time. So, is there anything scientists can do to overcome these problems and ensure that future published results are solid and replicable? Yes, there definitely is. Personally, I think the most promising approach is for studies to be reviewed before any data is collected. So here's the idea. When a scientist has an idea for an experiment, they write up their idea before they do any data collection. And then they send off their description of the proposed experiment to a scientific journal to be considered for publication. Other scientists who are experts in the field then review the proposal and evaluate whether the proposed study is solid. If the reviewers decide that it is, then the scientist would go off and conduct the study, and the scientific journal would agree to publish the paper whether the results turn out to be statistically significant or not. The only condition would be that the scientist has to conduct the study exactly as they described in their proposal. Now, this model has a lot of advantages. First, it likely leads to better designed studies because design problems that reviewers point out can be fixed before the study is ever done. It also eliminates the problem that only statistically significant results are published, and it therefore reduces publication bias. And finally, it would significantly reduce the opportunity for scientists to engage in questionable research practices because they have to commit to what they're going to do before they ever conduct the study. Well, we've now reached the end of our course on shocking psychological studies. I hope the journey has given you new insights into the world of psychological research and made you a more discerning consumer of the studies you hear about in the popular press. Perhaps you'll be sensitive to potential ethical violations, or a bit more skeptical about the reliability of a flashy new finding that hasn't been replicated. But I also hope that the course gives you a renewed appreciation for the self-correcting nature of science and real hope for the future. Although we've seen that bad science does get done, we've also seen that it gets exposed and corrected. Scientific ethics are discussed, evaluated, implemented, and refined. Flashy scientific results get tested to ensure their reliability, or to demonstrate their unreliability. Likewise, questionable scientific practices that might undermine the literature are publicly criticized, and better practices are constantly being adopted by the scientific community. The bottom line is that psychological research is constantly improving, and the future looks very bright. Thanks for listening.